some questions don't go away just because time passes. Across history, investigators have documented cases that resist easy explanation. Disappearances with no trail, patterns in ancient construction that predate the tools to measure them, phenomena recorded by multiple independent witnesses, yet never replicated under controlled conditions. Not folklore, not guesswork, cases with case files, sworn statements, and researchers who still disagree on what happened. Tonight, we're looking at the ones that never got closed, the ones science can describe but not fully explain. So sit back, relax, and let's dive in. In the southern reaches of Siberia, in the Tuva Republic near the Mongolian border, there is an island that should not exist where it does. It sits at the center of a high-altitude lake called Derinkuyu, ringed by mountains, accessible for only a few months a year before ice and isolation seal it off again. On that island stand the remains of a rectangular fortress wall, roughly 215 by 162 meters, built with a precision that has puzzled archaeologists for over a century. Locals call it Por-Bazhyn, clay house. From the air, its symmetry is almost unsettling. Straight lines, right angles, a layout that looks deliberate down to the degree. The mainstream account begins in the 8th century AD, when the region was under the control of the Uyghur Khaganate. Radiocarbon dating and dendrochronology place construction around 757 AD, likely commissioned by a ruler named Bayan Chor Khan. The architecture borrows heavily from Tang Dynasty Chinese palace design. Courtyards, axial symmetry, a central hall, which has led most historians to conclude it was built as a palace or administrative complex, a statement of power and cultural alignment with China rather than the nomadic traditions surrounding it. But here the story starts to fracture. Excavations have found almost no evidence of permanent habitation. No accumulated layers of daily life, no hearths worn smooth by use, no signs that anyone actually lived there for any meaningful length of time. A massive structure, built with extraordinary labor in one of the most remote and difficult-to-reach locations imaginable, and then abandoned almost immediately. Why build something this precise, this costly, this far from any major population center, only to leave it untouched? That question has opened the door to competing theories. Some researchers have proposed it wasn't a palace at all, but a Manichaean temple, a place of worship for a religion that briefly flourished among Central Asian elites before being suppressed. Others have suggested it functioned less as a residence and more as a ceremonial or astronomical site, its walls aligned with seasonal solar positions, a place built not to be lived in, but to be used at specific, perhaps ritual, moments in time. There's also the matter of the lake itself. Geological surveys suggest Derinkuyu may not have existed, at least not in its current form, when construction began, that the island fortress might once have stood on solid ground, later surrounded by water as permafrost shifted and melted beneath it. If true, the builders didn't choose an island. The island chose itself, centuries after the walls went up, reshaping a deliberate structure into something that looks, today, like a secret meant to be guarded by water. A major Russian-led expedition in 2007 brought renewed attention and resources to the site, mapping its foundations in detail and reinforcing the radiocarbon timeline. And yet, after all that work, the central question hasn't moved. What was this place actually for? A monument to a Khan's ambition? A temple for a vanished faith? A structure timed to the sky rather than to human routine? Stand at the shoreline today, looking out at those quiet, deliberate walls rising from still water, and the fortress offers no answers, only the unmistakable impression that it was built with intention. Somewhere in that intention is the truth. Whether it will ever surface is another matter entirely. If Por-Bazhyn teaches us that precision can be its own kind of mystery, the next site takes that lesson and carves it directly into the earth. not as walls, but as absence. Thousands of miles away, on the western slopes of the Peruvian Andes, near the Pisco Valley, there is a feature so strange that even describing it accurately takes effort. It's known as Monte Sierpa, the Band of Holes, and it consists of nearly 6,000 pits, dug in precise rows, stretching for almost a mile and a half across a dry, rocky hillside. From above, it looks less like a human structure and more like a strip of perforated film laid across the landscape, or the skin of some enormous ancient creature. Up close, each pit is roughly consistent in size, about a meter or two wide, a meter deep, arranged in segments that run in tight, deliberate lines up and down the slope. No one disputes that the Band of Holes was made by human hands. The question that has resisted every attempt at resolution is simpler and somehow harder. What were they for? The mainstream explanation, favored by many archaeologists, ties the site to the Chincha and later Inca civilizations, who controlled this region of Peru in the centuries before Spanish contact. Under this theory, the holes functioned as a kind of accounting system, a physical ledger. The Inca Empire was famous for managing vast territories without a written language, relying instead on quipu, the knotted cord systems used to record numbers, taxes, and resources. Some researchers propose that Monte Sierpe served a similar purpose on a landscape scale, a storage and tribute counting site, where goods like maize, beans, or coca leaves were measured out, pit by pit, as part of a tax or trade system administered across the empire. Soil analysis conducted in recent years lends this theory some support. Researchers have found traces of pollen from cultivated plants in several of the pits, suggesting that something organic, something agricultural, passed through them at some point. And yet, the evidence doesn't close the case so much as complicate it. If the holes were used for storage or counting, why this specific location, a steep, exposed hillside, difficult to access, with no obvious water source nearby and no remains of permanent settlement close enough to explain why such an elaborate system would be built here rather than somewhere more practical? Storage systems tend to cluster near the things being stored. Monte Sierpe sits apart from everything, a band of geometry carved into isolation. This is where the speculation begins to widen. Some researchers have pointed to the site's visibility from a distance and proposed it may have functioned as a marketplace, not for storage, but for a kind of barter exchange, where goods were laid out pit by pit for trade between different communities, a literal marketplace etched permanently into the hillside, used and reused across generations. Under this theory, the holes weren't a ledger at all, but something closer to stalls, a fixed physical infrastructure for commerce in a society without paper records or permanent buildings. Others have noted the band's resemblance, at a distance, to a quipu itself, its rows and segments echoing the knotted, sectioned structure of the cords the Inca used for record-keeping. Is it possible that the landscape was made to mirror the math? That this hillside functioned as something like a physical, walkable spreadsheet, a place where abstract administrative concepts were translated into earth and stone so that they could be seen, measured, and walked from end to end? Then there are theories that step further from the administrative and into the ceremonial. Some researchers have suggested ritual or astronomical functions, pointing to the way certain segments of the band appear to align with seasonal markers or with sightlines toward the surrounding mountains, though this interpretation remains far more contested than the storage or marketplace theories, with critics noting that with thousands of pits spread across such a length, some alignment with the landscape may simply be a matter of probability rather than design. What makes the Band of Holes especially difficult to resolve is its age. Unlike the Inca sites with extensive documentation, dating the holes precisely has proven elusive. Some researchers argue the system may predate the Inca entirely, originating instead with the earlier Chincha culture or even older inhabitants of the valley, with the Inca later inheriting and repurposing a structure they did not originally build. If that's true, then the holes may carry two histories layered on top of each other, one purpose at their creation, another imposed centuries later by a different civilization entirely. Stand at one end of Monte Sierpe and look down its length, and the band seems to vanish into the haze of the hillside, 6,000 small absences stretching toward a horizon that offers no further explanation. A ledger, a marketplace, a calendar, a relic of a culture whose name we may not even know. Each theory accounts for some of the evidence. None of them accounts for all of it. Perhaps the most honest answer is the simplest one, that a society went to extraordinary, coordinated effort to carve thousands of identical pits into a barren slope, for a reason significant enough to justify the labor. And that reason, whatever it was, left no other trace. The holes remain. The explanation does not. If Monte Sierpe is a mystery of absence, holes carved into a hillside, meaning long since drained out of them, the next site is the opposite. It is a mystery of overwhelming presence, of a surface so densely covered in carved symbols that researchers have struggled for over a century simply to count them all, let alone explain them. In a quiet residential suburb of West Dunbartonshire, Scotland, just north of Glasgow, beneath a school playing field in the town of Paisley, lies one of the largest and most complex prehistoric rock carvings in all of Europe. It is known as the Cochno Stone, and for most of its existence it has not been visible at all. It has been buried. The stone itself is enormous, roughly 13 meters by 8, a flat outcrop of natural rock covered in more than 90 carved cup and ring marks, geometric patterns, grooves, and at least one carving that appears to depict a set of footprints. The cup and ring style is found at other sites across Britain and Ireland, dating broadly to the Neolithic and early Bronze Age, sometime between 3000 and 1500 BC. But the Cochno Stone's sheer density of carving sets it apart from nearly every comparable site on the continent. Nowhere else in Europe has this much Neolithic rock art been found concentrated on a single surface. And for most of its modern history, almost no one could see it. The stone was first formally documented in 1887 by Reverend James Harvey, whose detailed survey remains one of the most important records of the site. For decades afterward, it sat exposed, visited by antiquarians and curious locals. But by the mid-20th century, the area around it had been developed into housing, and the stone, sitting in the open, accessible to anyone, began to suffer. Visitors carved their initials into it. Some accounts describe attempts at unauthorized excavation. Concerned about ongoing damage, archaeologists made a decision in 1965 that would define the stone's fate for the next half-century. They buried it. The entire carved surface was covered with soil, sealing it beneath the ground, hidden from view in order to protect what remained. For 50 years, the Cochno Stone existed mostly as a memory, known through Harvey's 19th century drawings, photographs, and the testimony of those who had seen it before the burial. It wasn't until 2015 and 2016 that a research team, using drone photography, 3D laser scanning, and digital modeling, briefly re-exposed the stone to create a comprehensive digital record before reburying it once again. What they found, when they compared the new scans to Harvey's century-old survey, raised as many questions as it answered. Some markings recorded in 1887 appeared to have changed, faded, altered, or in a few cases, seemingly different from earlier descriptions. Whether this reflects natural erosion, damage from decades of foot traffic before the burial, inconsistencies in the original Victorian documentation, or something less easily explained, remains a point of quiet debate among those who have studied the site closely. The mainstream interpretation of the Cochno Stone situates it within the broader, still unresolved puzzle of cup and ring art across Atlantic Europe. Most archaeologists agree the markings were created by Neolithic or early Bronze Age communities, likely over an extended period, with different carvings possibly added by different hands across generations rather than all at once. Beyond that consensus, agreement breaks down quickly. Why carve cups and rings in the first place? No society that produced this art left behind a written explanation, and the symbols themselves resist easy translation. One leading theory connects the markings to ritual or ceremonial use. The idea that the stone functioned as a gathering place, where the carvings themselves may have been created as part of ceremonies, perhaps marking significant events, seasonal observances, or rites of passage, with new rings added over time the way later generations might add names to a monument. Other researchers have proposed a more practical function, suggesting the patterns could represent early maps or territorial markers, encoding information about land, water sources, or pathways that has long since lost its key. From there, the theories grow more speculative. Some researchers have noted that certain cup and ring formations across multiple sites in Britain appear to echo astronomical patterns, though, as with Monte Sierpe, critics caution that with enough carved circles spread across enough surfaces, some apparent alignment with stars or solstices may emerge from chance rather than intention. The footprint carving in particular has drawn its own fringe interpretations, with some suggesting a connection to ritual investiture, a place where leadership or authority may have been symbolically conferred, though this remains firmly in the realm of speculation rather than established archaeology. What makes the Cochno Stone unusually poignant among unexplained sites is the choice that was made about it in living memory. Twice now, in 1965 and again after the 2016 survey, the decision has been made to rebury it, not because the mystery was solved, but because protecting the stone seemed more urgent than displaying it. Today, beneath a quiet school field in Faifley, 90 carvings and more sit in the dark, mapped in extraordinary digital detail, but physically inaccessible, waiting. What were they trying to say, the people who returned to this stone again and again, adding ring after ring across generations? And what does it mean that the safest place for that message, in the end, was underground, visible only to those willing to dig, quite literally, for the answer? If the Cochno Stone is a mystery of burial, a message deliberately hidden to preserve it, the site we turn to now presents the opposite puzzle entirely. A mystery carved into a cliff face in plain sight, fully visible, fully exposed, and still no closer to being understood. In the Hyumarca Mountains of southern Peru, near the shore of Lake Titicaca, there is a sandstone wall that local tradition calls Aramu Muru, though it's more widely known by another name, the Gate of the Gods, or Puerta de Hyumarca. The structure itself is deceptively simple. It is a flat, vertical face of reddish-pink sandstone, roughly 7 meters wide and 7 meters tall, set into the natural rock of the hillside. At its center is a smaller, recessed niche, a doorway-shaped indentation, about 2 meters high, carved with clean, deliberate edges into the stone. It is not a functioning door, it leads nowhere. Behind the niche is solid rock. And yet the precision of its construction, the symmetry of the larger wall surrounding it, and the care taken in its smoothing and shaping all suggest it was not a random or natural formation, but a site built, or at least extensively modified, with clear intention. Local legend offers the most enduring explanation, and it's worth understanding on its own terms before considering the alternatives. According to oral tradition recorded among communities near Lake Titicaca, the gate is named for a priest called Aramu Muru, said to have once carried a golden disc of great spiritual significance, variously described as a key, a map, or a sacred object tied to ancient Andean cosmology. The legend holds that when pursued or in danger, Aramu Muru used the disc at this precise location, and the rock itself opened, allowing him to pass through into another realm, after which the doorway sealed permanently behind him, leaving only the carved outline we see today. The story is not treated by archaeologists as literal history, but its persistence, passed down specifically about this location, rather than any of the dozens of other rock formations in the region, has made it inseparable from how the site is discussed. The mainstream archaeological position is considerably more restrained, though not without its own uncertainty. Most researchers agree the niche was carved by human hands, likely by pre-Inca or Inca-era communities, possibly as part of a ceremonial site connected to the broader spiritual significance of Lake Titicaca, which held deep cosmological importance across multiple Andean civilizations as a place of origin in their creation narratives. Under this view, the gate may have functioned as a shrine or ritual focal point, not a literal door, but a symbolic threshold, the kind of liminal architecture found at sacred sites worldwide, where a carved opening represents passage between the physical and spiritual without ever being meant to physically open at all. What complicates this explanation is the absence of certainty around exactly who built it and when. Unlike many Inca sites in the region, the Gate of Hayu Marca has resisted confident dating. Some researchers place its origins with pre-Inca cultures native to the Titicaca Basin, predating the Inca Empire by centuries. Others maintain it may be a later Inca-era ceremonial construction, drawing on older traditions but built within the empire's own architectural period. The lack of inscriptions, the absence of clear stylistic markers tying it definitively to one culture over another, and the relative isolation of the site from other excavated ruins have all made the question more difficult to settle than at many comparable Andean locations. It's in this uncertainty that more speculative interpretations have taken hold, particularly since the 1990s, when the site began attracting attention from researchers and visitors interested in alternative archaeology. Some have proposed that the niche functioned not as a symbolic threshold, but as a genuine architectural fragment of something larger, possibly the remnant of an entrance to an underground structure or tunnel system, since collapsed, buried, or sealed, with only the carved frame surviving above ground as evidence that something once continued beyond it. Others have pointed to persistent, though unverified, local reports describing unusual phenomena at the site, sounds, light, or shifts in perception experienced by visitors specifically at the niche. Interpretations that remain entirely outside mainstream archaeology, but that have nonetheless become part of how the location is discussed and visited today. What can be said with confidence is narrower than the legends suggest, but no less striking for it. Someone, at some point in the region's deep past, devoted real skill and effort to carving a doorway into solid rock that was never meant to be walked through, or that, if it once led somewhere, no longer does. Around the niche, smaller carved depressions mark the stone, possibly the remnants of additional details now eroded beyond recognition, possibly evidence of ritual elements lost to time. Stand before the gate today, and it offers exactly what it has offered for centuries, a threshold with nothing on the other side that anyone living has ever seen. A symbol, a shrine, a sealed passage. The wall keeps its own counsel, and the door, carved with such evident purpose, has never once opened for anyone willing to ask why it was made to look like it should. If the Gate of Hayu Marca is a mystery of a door that may never have opened, the site we turn to now presents almost the inverse problem. A wall whose very existence as a deliberate structure has been argued over for decades, with the debate itself becoming as significant as the object in question. In the remote Kaimanawa ranges of New Zealand's North Island, deep within dense forest accessible only by a difficult trek through the Department of Conservation's restricted wilderness. There is a rock face that has divided geologists and alternative researchers since the moment it was first widely photographed in 1996. What sits in that forest is a section of exposed rock, several meters wide, composed of what appear to be large rectangular blocks stacked in horizontal courses, flat tops, distinct vertical and horizontal joints, an overall impression, at first glance, of dressed masonry, the kind of construction one might expect from a deliberately built wall rather than a natural outcrop. It became known almost immediately upon its public unveiling as the Kaimanawa Wall. The site first reached wide attention through Barry Brailsford, a New Zealand historian who, along with researcher Bruce Cathy, brought the formation to public and media attention in the mid-1990s, suggesting it might be evidence of construction far predating known Maori settlement of New Zealand, potentially, in the more speculative readings that followed, evidence of a lost or unrecorded civilization that occupied the islands thousands of years before the accepted timeline of Polynesian arrival, generally placed around 1300 AD. The claim, naturally, generated significant public interest, and the wall briefly became one of the most discussed archaeological controversies in the country's modern history. The scientific response was swift and largely unified. Geologists from the New Zealand Geological Survey, along with independent researchers, examined the formation and concluded that what appeared to be deliberately cut blocks was, in fact, the product of natural geological processes, specifically the columnar jointing and weathering patterns characteristic of the volcanic ignimbrite rock common throughout the central North Island. This type of rock, formed from compacted volcanic ash deposited during eruptions tens of thousands of years ago, is known to fracture along remarkably regular lines as it cools and erodes, sometimes producing formations that bear a striking, even unsettling resemblance to deliberate masonry. Similar natural formations, sometimes called Giant's Causeways in other parts of the world, have been documented extensively elsewhere, lending strong support to the conclusion that the Kaimanawa Wall, however striking its appearance, is a product of geology rather than human hands. This explanation remains the position held by the overwhelming majority of geologists and archaeologists who have examined the site, and it is generally treated as the closed case within mainstream science. And yet, the wall has never entirely receded from public conversation, for reasons that go beyond stubbornness or wishful thinking. Part of what has kept the debate alive is the formation's specific characteristics. Proponents of the artificial origin theory have pointed to what they describe as unusually consistent block dimensions across the visible section, sharper than expected corner angles in places, and a regularity that, in their assessment, exceeds what they would expect from natural fracturing alone, even accounting for columnar jointing. Critics of this view counter that human perception is prone to pattern recognition, that the brain is wired to see deliberate design in random or naturally regular formations, a tendency well documented in psychology, and that without controlled excavation or detailed geological dating of the specific formation, claims of unusual precision remain subjective impressions rather than measured evidence. This points to perhaps the most persistent issue surrounding the Kaimanawa Wall. Despite the intensity of the public debate in the 1990s, no comprehensive, peer-reviewed excavation of the site was ever conducted to fully settle the matter beyond visual and surface-level geological assessment. The site sits within a conservation area with restricted access, and the controversy, intense as it was at its peak, cooled before it produced the kind of exhaustive scientific documentation that might have closed the question definitively for skeptics and proponents alike. What exists instead is a body of photographs, a handful of geological opinions, and a debate that effectively paused rather than resolved. The broader question the Kaimanawa Wall raises extends beyond this single formation. New Zealand's accepted human history begins with Polynesian voyagers arriving roughly 7 centuries ago, a timeline supported by extensive archaeological, linguistic, and genetic evidence. Claims of a far older, unrecorded civilization sit well outside this established record, unsupported by the broader pattern of evidence found across the islands. Most researchers regard the wall's natural explanation as sound specifically because it fits this wider, well-documented context, not because the formation was dismissed without consideration. Still, the wall remains where it has always been, deep in a forest few visitors ever reach. Its rectangular blocks catching the light the same way, whether they were shaped by magma cooling tens of thousands of years ago or by hands that left no other trace. Geology offers the simpler answer, and likely the correct one. But in a landscape where no full excavation was ever completed, where the file was effectively closed by consensus rather than conclusive proof, a quiet question remains for anyone willing to make the difficult walk into the Kaimanawa Ranges. What exactly would it take to be completely certain? If the Kaimanawa Wall is a debate about whether nature mimicked design, the site we turn to now flips that question entirely. Here, no one disputes that the marks are artificial. What remains unresolved is almost everything else. On the island of Malta, particularly across the exposed limestone plateau known as Clapham Junction, near the town of Sigiwi, the bare rock is carved with hundreds of parallel grooves, twin channels cut directly into the stone, running for meters at a time, crisscrossing the landscape, climbing slopes, converging, diverging, occasionally vanishing off the edge of a cliff into open air. They are known as the Cart Ruts of Malta, and despite their straightforward name, they have resisted a fully satisfying explanation for well over a century. The basic geometry is consistent across the island. 2 parallel grooves, typically spaced between about 110 and 140 centimeters apart, cut to depths ranging from a few centimeters to, in some places, over half a meter, worn or carved into the soft Globigerina limestone that makes up much of Malta's surface. Hundreds of these ruts exist, sometimes running for considerable distances, sometimes forming dense, tangled networks where multiple tracks overlap and cross, giving Clapham Junction its name, a nod to the famously complex railway interchange in London, applied here with a certain dry irony to a feature that predates trains by thousands of years. The most widely accepted explanation is also the most literal, that the ruts are wheel tracks, the accumulated result of cart traffic over an extended period, with wheels or sled-like runners gradually wearing channels into the relatively soft limestone as the same routes were used again and again across generations, perhaps centuries. Under this view, the parallel spacing reflects the standard axle width of carts used by Malta's prehistoric or early historic inhabitants, and the depth of individual ruts reflects how long and how heavily a given route was traveled. This explanation has substantial support. It accounts for the parallel spacing, the wear patterns, and the way some ruts appear to deepen gradually along their length, consistent with repeated mechanical erosion rather than a single act of carving. And yet, the more closely the ruts are examined, the more this straightforward explanation strains against the physical evidence. Some ruts run directly off the edges of cliffs, ending abruptly in open air over drops of several meters, with no indication of where a path might have continued below, and no plausible reason a cart would have been driven toward a precipice. Others run beneath the waterline, submerged just off the coast near Malta, visible to divers in shallow water. A detail that has fueled discussion not because it implies anything especially exotic, but because it raises a genuine and still debated question about sea level change in the region since the Ruts were formed, with some researchers suggesting it points to a significantly lower ancient coastline, gradually submerged over thousands of years. Elsewhere on the island, Ruts appear to climb gradients steep enough that conventional cart travel would have been extraordinarily difficult, if not impractical, raising the question of what kind of vehicle, animal, or method could have produced such consistent tracks across such varied and challenging terrain. Dating the Ruts precisely has proven its own persistent obstacle, because they are carved into exposed rock rather than associated with datable organic material, and because the same roots may have been used and reworn across vastly different periods. Estimates for their age span an unusually wide range, with some researchers connecting them to Malta's Bronze Age inhabitants, roughly 2000 BC, while others argue certain rut networks could be considerably older, potentially linked to the island's enigmatic Neolithic temple-building culture responsible for sites like Gantija and Hagar Chim, structures that themselves number among the oldest freestanding monuments anywhere in the world. This uncertainty has opened space for theories beyond simple cart traffic. Some researchers have proposed the Ruts may not represent wheel tracks at all, but instead channels cut deliberately for an entirely different purpose, perhaps as part of an irrigation or water management system, exploiting Malta's limestone geology to direct rainwater across the agriculturally challenging terrain of the island. Others have suggested the tracks may have served to transport not goods, but stone, heavy construction material moved on sledges rather than wheeled carts, dragged along the same routes repeatedly during the construction of Malta's megalithic temples, with the grooves representing not transportation infrastructure in general, but the specific physical record of an enormous, sustained building effort whose other traces have long since disappeared. What makes the cart ruts particularly difficult to resolve is the sheer scale of the network itself. This isn't an isolated formation in one remote location. It is hundreds of interconnected grooves spread across a significant portion of the island, suggesting not a single event or a single purpose, but possibly centuries of accumulated use by multiple cultures for reasons that may have shifted and overlapped over time, leaving behind a record that resists a single, tidy explanation precisely because it may never have had one. Walk across Clapham Junction today, and the ruts simply continue past where your understanding of them ends, climbing a slope, crossing another track, disappearing off a cliff edge into the Mediterranean air. Something was being moved again and again, deliberately, for long enough to carve solid limestone. The destination and the reason for the journey remain as worn away as the stone itself. If the cart ruts of Malta are a mystery of motion, a record of countless journeys whose destination is lost, the site we turn to now is the opposite kind of puzzle. A city that stopped moving entirely, abandoned so completely and preserved so well that it reads less like a ruin and more like a pause. In the southeastern desert of Iran, in the Sistan and Baluchistan province near the Afghan border, the dry, wind-scoured plain holds the remains of one of the largest and most sophisticated Bronze Age cities ever discovered in the region. Its modern name translates plainly and a little ominously to the Burnt City. It is known as Shahr-e Sukhteh. The city's history, as reconstructed through decades of excavation, spans roughly from 3200 to 1800 BC, a period during which Shahr-e Sukhteh grew into a major urban center along trade routes connecting the Indus Valley, Mesopotamia, and Central Asia. At its height, it may have housed tens of thousands of residents, organized into distinct districts, separate areas for housing, industry, and burial. A level of urban planning that has surprised archaeologists given the site's relative remoteness from the better-known civilizations of the ancient world. The city earned its name from extensive burn layers found during excavation. evidence that it was destroyed by fire on at least 3 separate occasions across its history, each time rebuilt, until a final decline left it abandoned for good sometime before 1800 BC. What makes Shahr-e Sukhteh extraordinary isn't simply its size or its age, but the remarkable specificity of what archaeologists have recovered from its arid, well-preserving soil, discoveries that have steadily complicated the assumption that this was simply another Bronze Age settlement, no more advanced than its neighbors. In a grave dated to around 2800 to 2500 BC, archaeologists uncovered a skeleton fitted with an artificial eyeball, a small sphere crafted from a bitumen paste, coated in a thin layer of gold, engraved with a fine pattern of lines radiating outward like an iris, and pierced with tiny holes that may have allowed it to be held in place with gold thread. Wear patterns on the eye socket suggest the prosthetic was worn during life, not simply placed in burial, raising a striking and still largely unanswered question. Who in this Bronze Age society possessed both the medical understanding and the craftsmanship necessary to create and fit a functional ocular prosthesis, roughly 48 centuries before such procedures became standard practice anywhere else in the historical record? The eye is not an isolated anomaly. Excavations have also uncovered what researchers have described as one of the earliest known examples of animation, a small earthenware goblet, dated to approximately 2500 BC, decorated around its circumference with 5 sequential images of a goat leaping toward a tree to graze on its leaves. When the images are viewed in rapid succession, as they would appear if the vessel were spun, they create the impression of continuous motion, a visual technique that would not become formally understood and applied again until thousands of years later, with the advent of early animation devices in the modern era. Alongside these finds, excavations have produced one of the oldest known backgammon-style board games, complete with carved dice, evidence of advanced surgical practice, including what appears to be a skull that underwent successful trepanation with signs of bone healing afterward, and one of the earliest surviving examples of a ruler, a measuring tool crafted with notable precision, suggesting standardized measurement was already in practical use at the site thousands of years before such systems are typically assumed to have developed in isolated regional centers. The mainstream archaeological position treats these discoveries, individually, as remarkable but explicable, evidence that Shahr-e Sukhteh was simply a far more advanced and interconnected society than its remote desert location might suggest. A city positioned at the crossroads of multiple major trade networks, absorbing and developing technical knowledge from contact with Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, and other contemporary centers of innovation. Under this view, the artificial eye, the animated goblet, and the surgical evidence are not isolated anomalies requiring exotic explanation, but data points supporting a broader, ongoing reassessment of how technologically sophisticated certain Bronze Age societies actually were. An adjustment to the timeline of innovation, not a rupture in it. What keeps the conversation around Shahr-e Sukhteh open, however, is less any single artifact and more their accumulation in one place. A functional prosthetic eye, an animation sequence with no clear precedent, evidence of skull surgery survived and healed, a standardized measuring tool. Each discovery alone might be absorbed comfortably into the existing historical record. Together, clustered within a single Bronze Age city, they paint a picture of innovation arriving in concentrated, almost disproportionate bursts, and they invite a genuinely open question that mainstream archaeology continues to investigate rather than dismiss. Was Shahr-e Sukhteh simply fortunate in what its dry soil happened to preserve, while comparable innovations elsewhere disintegrated without a trace? Or did this particular city, at this particular crossroads, develop capabilities that genuinely outpaced its era? And if so, what else might still be buried beneath that burnt, windswept plain, waiting for the next excavation to bring it into the light? If Shahr-e Sukhteh is a mystery of innovation arriving too early, the site we turn to now is a mystery of construction that seems, in some ways, to belong to an entirely different age than the one it's officially assigned to. Behind, the great temple of Seti the Firmwine at Abydos, in southern Egypt, sunk well below the surrounding ground level and reached by a long descending staircase, lies a structure unlike almost anything else in Egyptian architecture. Its massive stone blocks, some weighing many tons, are fitted together with a scale and severity that feels less like temple decoration and more like fortification. It is known as the Osireion, and even now, more than a century after its rediscovery, Egyptologists continue to debate not just its purpose, but its actual age. The Osireion was uncovered in stages beginning in 1903, with significant excavation work carried out by Margaret Murray, and later by other archaeologists working under Flinders Petrie, the renowned British Egyptologist whose team systematically cleared and documented the site through the early 20th century. What they found was a structure built largely underground, its massive granite and limestone blocks forming a central hall surrounded by a kind of artificial island, with channels designed to be filled with water, evoking the primordial mound of creation described in Egyptian mythology, the moment land first emerged from the waters of chaos at the beginning of the world. The mainstream archaeological position situates the Osireion firmly within the reign of Pharaoh Seti I, who ruled during Egypt's 19th dynasty, around 1290 to 1279 BC, with construction understood as a cenotaph, a symbolic tomb, not intended for actual burial, built to honor Osiris, god of the afterlife and resurrection, and to architecturally reenact the Egyptian creation myth through its design. Under this interpretation, the building's placement behind Seti's temple, its connection via underground passage to the main structure, and its overall iconography all align coherently with established 19th dynasty religious practice. Most Egyptologists accept this dating without significant reservation, treating the Osireion as an unusual but explicable component of Seti's broader building program at Abydos. And yet, the structure itself has long struck observers, including credentialed archaeologists, as oddly inconsistent with that timeline. The architectural style is markedly different from the elaborately decorated, hieroglyph-covered temple sitting directly above it. The Osireion is built from massive, largely unadorned megalithic blocks, fitted together with a precision and severity reminiscent of far older Egyptian construction, such as the Valley Temple at Giza, generally associated with the 4th Dynasty Pyramid Complex, more than 1,000 years earlier than Seti's reign. This stylistic disconnect, a minimalist, megalithic substructure beneath a richly decorated New Kingdom temple, has fueled a genuine, long-running debate, distinct from purely speculative theorizing, about whether the Osireion's foundational structure might actually be considerably older than Seti's temple, with Seti's builders having rediscovered, repurposed, and built upon a far more ancient structure rather than constructing the entire complex from scratch. The geologist Robert Schoch, known for his controversial reassessment of the Great Sphinx's age based on water erosion patterns, has also pointed to weathering evidence at the Osireion as potentially supporting a significantly older construction date, though this view remains a minority position, contested by most mainstream Egyptologists who maintain that the erosion patterns can be adequately explained by the site's documented history of flooding, given its position below the regional water table for much of its existence, a practical engineering reality, rather than evidence of vast antiquity, that also explains why parts of the structure remain submerged or water damaged to this day. What complicates the debate further is the absence of definitive inscriptional evidence pinning down the substructure's original construction date independently of Seti's additions. Hieroglyphic texts found within the Osireion, including sections of the Book of the Dead and other funerary texts, are generally attributed to Seti I and his successor Merneptah, who completed portions of the decoration. But these texts decorate and elaborate upon the space rather than necessarily proving the underlying stonework was built in the same era, leaving open, at least to some researchers, the question of layered construction across vastly different periods of Egyptian history. This uncertainty has made the Osireion a recurring touchstone in broader discussions about how confidently Egyptologists can date megalithic construction based on stylistic and contextual evidence alone, particularly when a structure's architecture diverges so sharply from its surrounding, securely dated context. Most Egyptologists remain confident in the 19th dynasty attribution, viewing the architectural austerity as a deliberate, symbolic choice rather than evidence of a different builder entirely. A structure designed to evoke ancient, eternal stability through its very plainness, in contrast to the elaborately decorated temple above it. Descend the long stairway into the Osireion today, past the water that still occasionally pools among its ancient blocks, and the structure offers two stories at once, one written in hieroglyphs by Seti's scribes, attributing the space firmly to his reign and his devotion to Osiris, and another carried in the stone itself, in blocks fitted with a severity that seems to belong to an older world. Which version is the truth, or whether both might be, in different ways? The water that once filled these channels has receded. The question of what exactly it was built to hold has not. If the Osireion is a mystery of a structure whose true age is contested, the site we turn to now presents almost the opposite problem. Its age isn't really in question at all. What's missing is something far more basic: any written record that it was built in the first place. In Zhejiang Province, in eastern China, near the small town of Longyou, farmers fishing in a cluster of unremarkable ponds in 1992 made a discovery that would force local authorities to drain the water entirely. Beneath the surface were not natural sinkholes, as everyone had assumed for generations, but the entrances to an enormous network of man-made caverns, carved entirely by hand out of solid siltstone. They are known today as the Longyou Caves, and they remain by most measures one of the largest deliberate excavation projects in human history that no historical document appears to mention at all. Since that initial discovery, at least 24 individual caverns have been identified and partially excavated in the area, though local researchers believe the true number embedded throughout the surrounding hillside could be significantly higher. The scale of what's already been opened to the public is difficult to overstate. The largest chambers stretch up to 60 meters in length, with ceilings rising as high as 30 meters, supported by precisely carved, evenly spaced rock pillars left in place during excavation. Structural elements that suggest whoever built these spaces understood load-bearing engineering well enough to remove an extraordinary volume of stone, estimated in some assessments to exceed 1 million cubic meters across the full complex, without a single recorded structural collapse in the centuries, or millennia, since. What makes the caves especially striking on close inspection is the consistency of the tool marks covering nearly every surface. Walls, pillars, and ceilings throughout the complex are covered in parallel, evenly spaced striations, chiseled at a remarkably uniform angle, repeated across tens of thousands of square meters of excavated rock, with a regularity that has led some engineers and archaeologists who've examined the site to suggest the markings imply either an extraordinarily large, well-coordinated workforce operating under a single unified plan, or some method of stone removal more systematic than simple individual hand chiseling, though no specific alternative method has been conclusively demonstrated or agreed upon. And then there is the question that has proven hardest to resolve of all. Nobody knows, with any real confidence, who built them or precisely when. Unlike most major excavation projects of comparable scale found elsewhere in the world, the Longyou Caves appear in no surviving historical text from any of the dynasties that controlled the region throughout China's extensively documented imperial history. No local gazetteer, no county record, no inscription found at the site itself names a ruler, a workforce, or a stated purpose. This absence is what makes the site genuinely unusual among Chinese archaeological discoveries, given how thoroughly documented Chinese imperial administration tends to be across recorded history. A project of this scale, requiring such a massive sustained labor investment, would ordinarily be expected to leave at least some trace in regional records, tax accounts, or local chronicles, yet none has been found. Dating estimates, in the absence of textual evidence, have relied primarily on geological assessment of the surrounding sediment, comparative analysis of similar excavation techniques found at other dated sites in the region, and limited archaeological material recovered during excavation. Most researchers place the cave's construction sometime within the broader span of the Ming Dynasty or earlier, with some estimates extending back over 2,000 years to the Qin Dynasty era, though no single date has achieved firm consensus, and the range itself spans well over a millennium of uncertainty, an unusually wide window for a project this large in a region with this much surviving documentation from competing periods. The mainstream explanation for the cave's purpose centers on quarrying, the idea that the caverns represent a massive, sustained stone extraction operation, with the carved rock removed and used elsewhere for construction projects whose own historical records may simply not have survived, or may not have explicitly connected the building material back to its original source. Under this view, the absence of textual reference isn't necessarily mysterious, so much as an accident of historical record-keeping, with administrative documents from the relevant period lost over the centuries, as has happened with countless other historical projects throughout Chinese history. This explanation accounts for a great deal, but it doesn't fully resolve why a quarrying operation of this magnitude would also include such careful structural engineering, evenly spaced support pillars, smoothed walls, geometrically deliberate chamber shapes, features that go well beyond what raw material extraction alone would typically require, raising the open question of whether the caves may have served some secondary or even primary function beyond simple quarrying once the excavation was complete, whether ceremonial, administrative, or otherwise, that has likewise left no trace in the historical record. Stand today in one of the larger chambers, beneath a 30-meter ceiling, carved entirely by hand from solid rock, surrounded by pillars chiseled with a precision that would challenge modern equipment, and the silence carries its own kind of weight. Somewhere, a workforce large enough to move 1 million cubic meters of stone labored for what must have been years, possibly generations, and walked away from the historical record entirely. The caves remain. The builders, and their reasons, do not. If the Longyou Caves are a mystery of builders who left no record, the site we turn to now returns us to familiar ground. Malta, the same small Mediterranean island that gave us the cart ruts, but descends into something far stranger than carved tracks on open rock. Beneath the streets of Paola, in a quiet residential district just south of Valletta, lies an underground structure cut entirely into solid limestone, spanning 3 distinct levels and descending roughly 11 meters below the surface. It is known as the Hypogeum of Ħal Saflieni, and it is, by the assessment of UNESCO and most archaeologists who have studied it, one of the only known prehistoric underground temples in the world. A structure with no clear architectural precedent, and, in the millennia since its abandonment, no clear successor either. The Hypogeum was discovered by accident in 1902, when workmen cutting cisterns for new houses being built above broke through into a chamber no one knew existed. What followed was a series of excavations, led initially by Manuel Magri, and later continued by archaeologist Themistocles Zamet, whose work through the early 20th century gradually revealed the staggering scale of what lay beneath the unsuspecting streets above. Radiocarbon dating and stratigraphic analysis place the site's earliest use at approximately 4000 BC, with continuous use and expansion extending until roughly 2500 BC, making it contemporary with, and possibly connected to, the same Neolithic temple building culture responsible for Malta's above-ground megalithic structures like Gantija and Hagar Chim. What makes the Hypogeum extraordinary is not simply its age, but the level of architectural sophistication carved entirely by hand into solid rock, using nothing but stone, bone, and antler tools, without the benefit of metal implements. The deepest level contains chambers carved to deliberately mimic the trilithon architecture found in Malta's above-ground temples. Facades with false doorways, smoothed walls, and ceilings carved with the appearance of corbelled vaulting, all replicated underground in a medium that allowed for none of the structural shortcuts available to builders working with stacked stone above ground. One chamber in particular, known as the Oracle Room, has drawn sustained scientific attention for an acoustic property that researchers have confirmed through measurement rather than mere anecdote. A low male voice, spoken or chanted within it, resonates and amplifies throughout the surrounding chambers in a way that has been measured at specific low frequencies, generally cited around 110 Hz, a resonance some acoustic researchers have suggested may have been intentionally engineered, given how precisely it aligns with the chamber's dimensions, though whether the effect was a deliberate design goal or an emergent property, the original builders simply discovered and made use of remains genuinely unresolved. The most widely discussed aspect of the Hypogeum, however, concerns not its architecture but its contents. Excavations recovered the skeletal remains of an estimated 6,000 to 7,000 individuals, along with red ochre pigment, pottery, carved figurines including the well-known Sleeping Lady, and amulets, leading most archaeologists to interpret the site as both a necropolis and a ritual or ceremonial center used across many generations. A place where the Neolithic community buried their dead while also conducting rites tied to fertility, ancestry, or the underworld, themes echoed in the carved imagery and the figurines recovered from the site. This explanation is broadly accepted and well supported by the archaeological material itself. What has fueled more persistent debate are the skulls. Among the thousands of remains recovered, a small number of skulls were noted by early excavators, including Zamet himself, as exhibiting an unusual elongation, along with the absence of a typical sagittal suture, the line where the skull's plates normally fuse during development. Several of these skulls were photographed and documented in the early 20th century, before reportedly going missing from the collection at some point in the following decades, a loss that has made independent re-examination using modern techniques impossible, and that has, in turn, made the surviving black and white photographs themselves a subject of ongoing speculation. The mainstream explanation for the elongated skull centers on a well-documented practice known as artificial cranial deformation, the intentional binding of an infant's skull during early development, a practice attested across numerous ancient cultures worldwide, from parts of the Andes to ancient Egypt to the Pacific Northwest, generally undertaken for reasons of social status, cultural identity, or aesthetic preference. Most archaeologists regard this as the most plausible explanation for the Hypogeum skulls as well, consistent with practices known from comparable Neolithic contexts. The absence of the original specimens, however, has left this conclusion difficult to verify definitively against the alternative, more speculative interpretations that gained traction precisely because the physical evidence needed to settle the question outright is no longer available for study. Descend today into the Hypogeum's deepest chamber, 11 meters beneath a residential street that gives no hint of what lies below, and the silence itself becomes part of the experience. Visitor numbers are strictly limited, humidity and breath carefully monitored, in order to preserve a space that has already survived 6,000 years largely intact. Thousands of the dead once rested in these carved rooms, alongside red ochre, carved figurines, and at least a few skulls whose shape no one now living has been able to examine firsthand. What the original builders understood about sound, about the chamber's resonance, about whoever those few unusual individuals among the buried actually were, all of it remains exactly where it was left, underground, in the dark, just out of reach. If the Hypogeum of Ħal Saflieni is a mystery of depth, 11 meters of carved stone holding 6,000 years of silence, the site we turn to now expands that same question of underground ambition to a scale that's difficult to fully comprehend even while standing inside it. In Turkey's Cappadocia region, beneath the small town of Derinkuyu in Nevşehir province, the soft volcanic rock conceals a city. Not a cave system used occasionally for shelter, but a fully realized urban environment, carved downward across at least 18 distinct levels, reaching depths of approximately 85 meters below the surface, a vertical excavation deep enough to have once housed, by most archaeological estimates, somewhere between 20,000 and possibly as many as 60,000 people, along with their livestock, food stores, and places of worship, all hidden beneath an unassuming Anatolian landscape. Derinkuyu was rediscovered, in the modern sense, in 1963, when a local resident renovating his home broke through a wall and found a hidden passage leading downward into a room he hadn't known existed. A discovery that, much like the Hypogeum's accidental unearthing decades earlier, revealed only the smallest entry point into something far larger. Subsequent excavation gradually exposed the full scale of the city. Ventilation shafts, some extending the entire 85-meter depth, designed with such effective airflow that fresh air still circulates through portions of the complex today without mechanical assistance. Stables for livestock positioned on upper levels to keep animal odors and heat away from living quarters below. Wine and oil presses. Communal kitchens with blackened ceilings still bearing soot from fires lit centuries ago. A school with rooms believed to have served as a study hall. Chapels carved directly into the rock, complete with cruciform layouts. And, perhaps most remarkable, massive circular stone doors, some weighing as much as half a ton, fitted into purpose. Carved channels and designed to be rolled into place from the inside only, sealing individual levels off entirely against intruders who might breach the upper passages. The mainstream historical account situates Derinkuyu within the broader, well-documented tradition of underground construction across Cappadocia, a region whose unique geology, layers of soft volcanic tuff, easily carved when first exposed to air but hardening over time, made large-scale excavation practical, in a way few other landscapes on Earth could support. Cappadocia is honeycombed with dozens of known underground settlements, with Derinkuyu connected via a long subterranean tunnel stretching several kilometers to another major underground city at Kaymaklu, suggesting these sites functioned as part of an interconnected regional network rather than isolated independent projects. Most archaeologists believe the earliest excavation at Derinkuyu may date back to the Phrygian period, roughly the 8th to 7th century BC, with some researchers proposing even earlier Hittite-era origins for the first carved chambers, though firm consensus on the very earliest phase remains elusive given the difficulty of dating excavated rock directly. What is better documented is the city's extensive expansion and active use during the Byzantine era, particularly between the 7th and 10th centuries AD, when Christian communities in the region used Derinkuyu and similar underground complexes as places of refuge during periods of raids and conflict, most notably during conflicts with Arab armies in the 7th through 9th centuries. Under this widely accepted interpretation, Derinkuyu functioned primarily as a defensive shelter, a place where entire communities could disappear underground for extended periods, sealing the massive stone doors behind them, surviving on stored provisions and livestock until the danger above had passed. This explanation accounts for a great deal of what's been found at the site, and it remains the dominant scholarly position. And yet, the sheer scale and sophistication of Derinkuyu continues to raise questions that the defensive shelter explanation, while broadly accurate, doesn't fully resolve on its own. Why invest such enormous, sustained labor across what appears to have been many centuries of expansion by successive populations into a refuge intended only for occasional, temporary use rather than more modest defensive measures? The ventilation system alone represents a feat of engineering that required precise calculation of airflow across an 85-meter vertical span, accomplished without modern surveying tools, in a network extensive enough to support tens of thousands of people, along with their animals, for what may have been extended periods rather than brief emergencies. Some researchers have proposed that Derinkuyu may have functioned, at various points across its long and layered history, as more than just an emergency shelter, possibly serving in earlier or later periods as a more permanent or semi-permanent settlement, with families living substantial portions of their lives underground during periods of sustained regional instability rather than retreating below ground only during acute moments of danger. Others have noted that the full extent of the connected tunnel network across Cappadocia remains incompletely mapped, with some passages still unexcavated or deliberately sealed, raising the open question of how many additional chambers, connections, or even entirely separate underground settlements may still lie undiscovered beneath the region's surface, accessible only by chance, the way Derinkuyu itself was first found in 1963. There is also the matter of just how long the deepest levels were in continuous use, and by whom, given that the rock itself offers few definitive markers to separate one century's occupation from another's, in a space that may have been carved, abandoned, rediscovered, and recarved multiple times across more than 1,000 years of layered history. The Byzantine-era use is the best documented, supported by surviving chapels and inscriptions, but the foundational layers beneath that occupation remain comparatively obscure, their original builders and exact purposes pieced together more from geological inference than from direct historical record. Walk today through Derinkuyu's narrow, low-ceilinged passages, descending level by level into cooler, quieter air, past stables and wine presses and chapels carved by hands that left behind no names, and the scale of the undertaking becomes difficult to hold in proportion. An entire city, built downward rather than outward, designed to vanish from sight entirely and seal itself shut against the world above. How many generations gave themselves over to that excavation, level after level, without ever fully explaining, in any record that survives, exactly what they were building toward? And how much of that city, even now, remains unmapped beneath the quiet streets of Nevşehir, waiting for the next accidental wall to break? If Derinkuyu is a mystery of scale carved downward into darkness, the site we turn to now is a mystery of simplicity, multiplied to an almost unsettling degree. In the Diquís Delta of southern Costa Rica, scattered across what was once dense tropical forest and is now largely cleared farmland, sit hundreds of stone spheres, some no larger than a grapefruit, others measuring over 2 meters in diameter and weighing upward of 16 tons. Each one shaped with a roundness so close to geometric perfection that early observers struggled to believe they weren't manufactured by machine. They are known simply as the stone spheres of Costa Rica, or locally Las Bolas, and despite decades of study, the most basic questions about them remain only partially answered. The spheres were first brought to wide attention in the 1930s when the United Fruit Company began clearing land in the Dequise Delta for banana plantations, and workers started uncovering the stones buried in the soil, sometimes singly, sometimes in deliberate clusters and alignments. Word of the discovery eventually reached archaeologists, and serious scientific investigation began in earnest in the 1940s, led initially by Samuel Lothrop, whose early surveys documented dozens of spheres, and began the long process of trying to understand who made them and why. What's been established with reasonable confidence is the broad cultural and temporal context. The spheres are generally attributed to the Dequise culture, a pre-Columbian society that inhabited the Delta region, with construction spanning a wide window estimated between approximately 600 and 1500 AD, based on the archaeological layers and associated artifacts found alongside spheres still in their original, undisturbed locations. The stones themselves were carved primarily from gabbro, a hard igneous rock, though some smaller examples were shaped from other locally available materials, including coquina and sandstone, meaning the raw material had to be quarried, in many cases, from sources kilometers away from where the finished spheres were ultimately placed. The dominant archaeological explanation for both their creation and their function rests on two separate, though related, lines of investigation. Experimental archaeology has demonstrated that the spheres could plausibly have been shaped using a combination of controlled fracturing, hammerstones, and prolonged abrasive grinding with sand and water, a labor-intensive process, but not one requiring tools or techniques beyond what the Dequise culture is known to have possessed. This addresses the question of how the spheres were made, even if it doesn't fully convey just how extraordinary the resulting precision actually is. As for why, most archaeologists interpret the spheres as markers of social or political status, likely positioned in deliberate arrangements, rows, alignments, or geometric clusters, near the residences of high-status individuals or chiefs, possibly indicating wealth, authority, or serving some now obscured ceremonial or astronomical function tied to the social organization of Dequise settlements. It's the matter of precision, however, that has kept the spheres a subject of ongoing fascination well beyond typical academic circles. Measurements taken of the more complete, undamaged spheres have shown some examples deviating from a perfect sphere by mere millimeters across their entire diameter, a level of accuracy that has prompted genuine, sustained discussion among researchers about exactly what method could account for results this consistent using only Stone Age tools and abrasive techniques, especially across spheres ranging dramatically in size, from small stones to multi-ton boulders carved from raw quarried rock. Skeptics of the more elaborate theories point out that prolonged, patient grinding with simple tools, especially when paired with careful periodic measurement during the shaping process, can plausibly account for this precision given enough accumulated labor and generational knowledge passed down through specialized craftspeople, but the sheer number of spheres exhibiting this quality, well over 300 documented examples across the region, has made some researchers question whether such consistent results across so many individual objects, likely made by different hands over centuries, points to a more standardized or systematic production method than has yet been fully reconstructed. Compounding the difficulty is the matter of context. While Lothrop's original surveys and later more careful excavations did document a number of spheres found in situ, undisturbed in their original archaeological context, surrounded by other Dikis artifacts that helped establish dating and likely placement patterns. A significant proportion of the known spheres were displaced from their original locations decades ago, moved, sold, or relocated as plantation work, and later looting disturbed the sites before a systematic archaeological protection was established. This means that for many of the spheres scattered today across museum lawns, private properties, and public plazas throughout Costa Rica, their original placement, and therefore much of the contextual evidence that might explain their precise function or significance, has been permanently lost. This loss of context has left room for more speculative interpretation to take hold around the edges of the mainstream understanding. Some researchers and enthusiasts have proposed that certain spheres or clusters may reflect astronomical alignments, marking solstices or other significant celestial events, an interpretation similar to ones raised at other ancient sites worldwide. Though, as with those other cases, critics note that with so many spheres distributed across such a wide area, some degree of apparent alignment may emerge from chance rather than deliberate design, particularly given how many original locations are no longer verifiable. Others have focused on the sheer engineering challenge of producing spheres weighing up to 16 tons with such mathematical regularity, suggesting the production process may have involved more sophisticated measurement techniques, perhaps using cord and stake methods to continuously verify radius and roundness throughout the shaping process, than has typically been credited to the societies of the region. A theory that remains plausible but, like much else surrounding the spheres, difficult to confirm without direct evidence of the actual production process, none of which survived in any written or illustrated form. In 2014, the area's significance was formally recognized when UNESCO inscribed several of the sphere sites as a World Heritage Location, citing their importance as evidence of a complex and otherwise poorly understood pre-Columbian society. And yet, recognition has not delivered resolution. Stand today before one of the larger, undisturbed spheres, half sunk into delta soil, much as it has rested for perhaps 1,000 years, and the stone offers only its own silent geometry as an answer. A near-perfect sphere, carved by patient, deliberate hands, for a society that left behind extraordinary craftsmanship and almost nothing in the way of explanation. Was the perfection the point itself, a demonstration of skill and devotion? Or did these shapes once mean something far more specific, encoded in an arrangement now scattered, displaced, and largely impossible to fully reconstruct? If the stone spheres of Costa Rica are a mystery of perfect shape stripped of context, the site we turn to now presents a different but equally haunting puzzle. Thousands of carved stone vessels, scattered across an entire plateau, surrounded by a landscape so dangerous that, for much of the last half a century, studying them at all has been an act of considerable risk. In the Xianghuang Plateau of northern Laos, across more than 90 documented sites, lie thousands of massive stone jars, some barely a meter tall, others towering over 3 meters and weighing several tons, carved from sandstone, granite, and other locally available rock, scattered across hillsides and valleys in clusters that, much like Malta's cart ruts, seem to follow a logic not yet fully understood by anyone studying them today. This is the Plain of Jars, one of Southeast Asia's most striking and least explained archaeological landscapes. The jars themselves are remarkably consistent in basic form, generally cylindrical, often slightly tapered, many fitted with carved lips that suggest they were originally designed to hold lids, a handful of which have actually been recovered nearby, carved with decorative motifs including, in at least one notable example, a carved relief of a frog or similar animal figure. What's far less consistent and far more puzzling is everything surrounding their purpose. Despite the jars' number in the thousands across the wider region, no written record from any regional civilization, Lao, Khmer, Vietnamese, or otherwise, offers a clear, contemporaneous explanation of who carved them or why. Local oral tradition offers its own answer, one that predates formal archaeological investigation by generations and remains widely told today. According to this account, the jars were created by a legendary king named Kun Cheung, who, after winning a long and difficult military victory, ordered the massive vessels carved and used to brew and store enormous quantities of rice wine in celebration of the triumph. It's a vivid, specific story, but one archaeologists treat as folklore rather than literal history, given the absence of corroborating evidence. Though, much like the Aramu Muru legend in Peru, its persistence in local memory, specifically tied to this landscape and no other, has made it inseparable from how the site is popularly understood, even among those who don't take it as factual. The archaeological record points toward a different, though no less significant function. Excavations conducted by French archaeologist Madeleine Colani in the 1930s, whose extensive fieldwork remains the foundational study of the site nearly a century later, uncovered human remains, burial goods, and grave markers in proximity to numerous jar clusters, leading to the now dominant interpretation that the jars served a funerary purpose, likely as part of a practice involving excarnation or defleshing, where bodies were first left to decompose, possibly inside or near the jars themselves, before remains were later cremated or buried elsewhere, with the jars functioning as a transitional stage in this multi-step mortuary process. Radiocarbon dating of associated burial material has produced estimates suggesting that the broader burial practices at the site continued for an extended period, with some skeletal evidence dating to as late as the 9th to 13th century AD, though the jars themselves are generally believed to be considerably older, with most estimates placing their original carving and placement somewhere between 500 BC and 500 AD, based on stylistic and limited associated dating evidence, a range that itself reflects how difficult precise dating of the stone vessels has proven, given that the jars contain no organic material of their own that can be directly tested. This funerary interpretation, broadly accepted by most archaeologists working in the region today, doesn't fully resolve every aspect of the site, however. The jars' sheer number and distribution across such a wide and varied landscape raises questions about logistics that remain only partially answered. Quarrying and transporting jars weighing several tons each, across more than 90 separate locations spanning a significant portion of the plateau, would have required an enormous, sustained, and well-organized labor effort, suggesting a level of social and political organization in the region during this period that isn't otherwise extensively documented through other archaeological or textual sources from the same era. Compounding the challenge of fully understanding the site is the brutal reality of the plateau's more recent history. During the Vietnam War, the Xiangkhouang Plateau was subjected to one of the most intensive bombing campaigns in modern military history, leaving the region littered with unexploded ordnance that, even today, continues to restrict where archaeologists can safely excavate. Vast sections of the Plain of Jars remain effectively off-limits to systematic study, not because of any inherent secrecy surrounding the site, but because of the very real danger still buried beneath its surface, meaning that significant portions of this landscape, including potentially undiscovered jar clusters or undisturbed burial evidence that could meaningfully advance the dating and interpretation of the site, may remain inaccessible for the foreseeable future, regardless of how much interest or resources are eventually directed towards studying them. In 2019, UNESCO inscribed the Plain of Jars as a World Heritage Site, formally recognizing both its archaeological significance and the urgency of preserving it amid these ongoing safety challenges, a designation that has helped direct renewed international attention and funding toward careful, methodical clearance, and excavation efforts that continue, slowly and cautiously, today. Walk among the jars at one of the more accessible sites today, weathered stone rising from quiet grassland under an open sky, and the scale of the unanswered questions becomes apparent in a way that's almost physical. Thousands of vessels, carved with evident purpose and considerable effort, spread across a landscape that holds, somewhere beneath its still dangerous soil, the rest of the story. How many more clusters remain unmapped, sealed off not by mystery but by munitions decades old? And what might those still hidden sites reveal about the people who carved stone on this scale, then left behind no name, no inscription, and no certainty about why? Only a plain full of jars, waiting in the open, for a story they cannot tell on their own. If the plain of jars is a mystery of ancient builders who left no name behind, the site we turn to now is almost the inverse. A mystery built entirely by one known, documented individual, working alone, within living memory, and yet somehow no less baffling for it. In Homestead, Florida, just south of Miami, sits a peculiar compound of massive coral limestone structures, walls and furniture, a sundial, a working well, and a 9-ton gate so precisely balanced it could once be pushed open with a single finger. It's known as Coral Castle, and unlike nearly every other site explored so far, we know exactly who built it, when, and largely why. What we don't know is how. The man behind Coral Castle was Edward Leedskalnin, a Latvian immigrant who arrived in the United States in the early 20th century, standing barely 5 feet tall and weighing, by most accounts, around 100 pounds. According to the story he told, and that has been repeated ever since, Leedskalnin began construction after being left at the altar by his fiancée back in Latvia, a heartbreak he reportedly referred to throughout his life as the inspiration for what he called his Sweet 16, a name some interpreted as a reference to his former fiancée's age. Beginning around 1923 in nearby Florida City, and later relocating the entire operation, stone by stone, to its current homestead location in 1936, Leedskalnin spent close to 3 decades single-handedly quarrying, carving, transporting, and assembling tens of thousands of tons of oolitic limestone coral rock into an elaborate complex of monuments, furnishings, and astronomical features. What makes this story remarkable isn't simply that he did it, but that he did it entirely alone, by his own insistence, working almost exclusively at night, allowing no observers, and leaving behind no detailed account, blueprint, or explanation of his specific methods. Neighbors reported hearing the sounds of work, stone being moved, tools being used, but no one is known to have directly witnessed Leedskalnin quarrying or moving the massive blocks that make up the structure, some of which weigh in excess of 30 tons, comparable in scale to individual stones used in some of the world's most famous megalithic monuments, yet manipulated here by a single man working with minimal modern equipment in 20th century America, under conditions that should have been thoroughly documented by the standards of the era, yet largely weren't. The mainstream explanation for how Leedskalnin accomplished this rests on his own documented expertise and on principles of practical engineering that, while impressive, fall within the bounds of known physics. Leedskalnin is known to have studied engineering and physics independently, and the tools recovered from the site after his death in 1951, including a tripod, blocks and tackle, winches, and hand tools fashioned from automobile parts, demonstrate a working knowledge of leverage, fulcrums, and mechanical advantage sufficient, according to most engineers who've studied the recovered equipment, to plausibly explain how a single determined and resourceful individual could move and place stones of this size over an extended period, given enough time, patience, and ingenuity, even without modern machinery. Under this explanation, the central mystery of Coral Castle isn't a violation of physics so much as an extraordinary, almost obsessive feat of solitary persistence, achieved through cleverness and mechanical principles that, while not fully documented by Leedskalnin himself, are not inherently inexplicable. And yet this explanation, however reasonable, has never entirely settled the matter for everyone who has examined the site closely, in part because of Leedskalnin's own cryptic comments on the subject. He reportedly told visitors and reporters on multiple occasions that he understood the secrets used in building the pyramids of Egypt, and that he had discovered fundamental principles related to magnetism and what he termed Earth's magnetic current, ideas he expanded on in a series of self-published pamphlets exploring his personal theories of magnetism and cosmic forces, theories that remain outside accepted physics, but that he apparently believed, sincerely, to be directly relevant to how he accomplished his construction work. He consistently declined to explain his actual methods in detail, reportedly telling at least one visitor that he had discovered the secrets of the pyramids, without elaborating further, a statement that has been repeated and amplified considerably in the decades since, well beyond what Leedskalnin himself is documented as having actually claimed. The most frequently cited piece of physical evidence used to support more speculative interpretations is the 9-ton coral gate positioned at the compound's entrance, balanced with such precision on an improvised bearing that, for decades, it could reportedly be opened with the gentle push of a single finger, a detail confirmed by numerous visitors over the years before mechanical wear eventually required restoration work in the 1980s, after the gate's original bearing system finally failed. Engineers who've studied the gate's design generally agree that its function relies on a centered pivot point, and the kind of careful balance achievable through patient trial and error, rather than anything outside conventional mechanics, even as the precision required to achieve that balance with the tools available to Leedskalnin continues to impress those who examine it firsthand. What ultimately keeps Coral Castle in active discussion, even among those who accept the conventional engineering explanation, is less any single piece of evidence and more the totality of circumstances surrounding its creation. A single, slightly built man, working entirely alone, almost exclusively under cover of darkness, moving stones comparable in scale to ancient megalithic construction, using tools that explain the mechanism but not fully the sustained physical effort required, while making repeated, specific reference to ancient construction secrets he claimed, however vaguely, to have personally rediscovered. Visit Coral Castle today, and you can walk freely among the furniture, the sundial accurate enough to mark the hour, and the great coral gate, still standing, still balanced, in a quiet residential corner of South Florida. Leedskalnin left behind no journal detailing his methods, no witnesses to the actual moments of construction, only the finished structures themselves, and a handful of tantalizing, unverified remarks about secrets borrowed from a much older world. Did he simply work harder, longer, and more cleverly than anyone gave him credit for? Or did he genuinely stumble onto something about leverage, balance, or material handling that he never fully documented, and that left with him when he died alone in 1951? The stones, as ever, keep their silence. If Coral Castle is a mystery of a known builder whose methods stayed hidden, the site we turn to now reverses the equation entirely. Here, the builders are entirely unknown, and even the most basic question, how old this place actually is, has become one of the most contentious debates in modern archaeology. On a forested hilltop in West Java, Indonesia, terraced steps lead up to a series of stone platforms covering an area considerably larger than most ancient monuments anywhere in the world. It is known as Gunung Padang, and depending on which researchers you ask, it is either a remarkable but conventional megalithic site from the relatively recent past, or one of the oldest known examples of monumental construction on the planet, predating both the pyramids of Giza and Stonehenge by thousands of years. The site itself consists of 5 terraced levels, connected by stone stairways, covering the summit and upper slopes of what was long assumed to be a natural hill. The terraces are constructed primarily from columnar basalt rock, naturally occurring in hexagonal and pentagonal shapes formed through volcanic cooling processes, similar to formations found at other famous basalt sites around the world. These columns were arranged by human hands into walls, platforms, and stairways, and the site has been recognized by Indonesian archaeologists for decades as a significant megalithic monument generally associated with the later prehistoric period of Indonesian history, with surface-level construction estimated at roughly 2,000 to 3,000 years old, a dating that remains broadly uncontroversial among most mainstream researchers studying the visible, upper portions of the site. The controversy begins beneath the surface. Starting in 2011, a multidisciplinary Indonesian research team, led by geologist Danny Hilman Natawijaya, began an extensive program of subsurface investigation at Gunung Padang, employing ground-penetrating radar, electrical resistivity tomography, seismic tomography, and core drilling samples extracted from deep within the hill itself. What this research claimed to find, published in a series of papers culminating in a 2023 study, was nothing short of extraordinary. Evidence suggesting that the hill was not simply a natural formation later modified with surface terraces, but contained multiple distinct layers of deliberate construction extending far deeper into the hill than previously assumed, with the team proposing that the deepest of these layers could date back as far as 16,000 to even 27,000 years, based on radiocarbon dating of organic material recovered from soil matrix surrounding what they identified as constructed elements deep within the core samples. If accurate, this would place the earliest construction phases at Gunung Padang firmly within the last ice age, predating not only Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, currently recognized as one of the oldest known monumental sites in the world, at roughly 11,000 years old, but doing so by a margin of thousands of additional years, a claim that, if substantiated, would fundamentally reshape the understood timeline of organized human construction and, by extension, our broader understanding of when and how complex human societies first began undertaking large-scale building projects. The response from the wider archaeological community was predictably intense scrutiny. Critics of the 2023 study, including a number of archaeologists who published a formal rebuttal, raised several significant methodological concerns. Among the most pointed criticisms was the argument that radiocarbon dating organic material found within soil surrounding stone structures does not necessarily date the construction of those structures themselves, since soil and organic matter can shift, settle, and become incorporated into deeper layers through entirely natural geological processes over thousands of years, independent of any human activity at those depths. Critics further argued that the deeper layers identified through ground-penetrating radar and seismic tomography may represent natural volcanic rock formations and geological layering, rather than deliberately constructed human terraces, suggesting the research team may have interpreted naturally occurring basalt columns, similar to the very formations comprising the well-established upper terraces, as evidence of intentional ancient construction at depths where no clear architectural features, like worked stone surfaces or identifiable tool marks, were directly recovered. Following the publication of this rebuttal and the broader controversy it generated, the journal that had published the original 2023 study, Archaeological Prospection, retracted the paper, citing concerns over the validity of some of the interpretations and methodology, though the retraction itself became a further point of contention, with the original research team maintaining that their core findings and data remained valid, and that the retraction reflected disagreement over interpretation rather than any flaw in the underlying physical evidence collected from the site. This leaves Gunung Padang in a genuinely unusual position among the sites explored throughout this investigation. Not a case where mainstream science offers a confident, settled explanation against which fringe theories push back, but a case where credentialed researchers, using sophisticated modern instrumentation, have directly disputed each other's interpretation of the same physical evidence, with the matter very much unresolved within the scientific literature itself, rather than confined to popular speculation outside it. What's not in dispute is that something significant lies beneath Gunung Padang's visible terraces. The radar and resistivity surveys consistently detected distinct subsurface layers and cavities, regardless of how those features are ultimately interpreted. And further excavation, conducted carefully and methodically, could in principle resolve much of the current disagreement by directly examining whether deeper layers show genuine evidence of human modification, such as worked tool marks or deliberately placed materials, or whether they represent natural geological formation after all. Such excavation, however, requires significant resources, regulatory approval, and a level of caution that the controversy itself has, if anything, made more difficult to secure quickly. Climb the stone stairways of Gunung Padang today, past terraces whose recent era construction nobody seriously disputes, and stand on a hilltop that may hold, somewhere beneath your feet, either a remarkable but explicable layering of natural and human-made stone, or evidence that would force a substantial rewriting of when human beings first began building on a monumental scale. The instruments have already detected something down there. Whether it's geology or history, the ground itself has not yet been asked to give up a clear enough answer. If Gunung Padang is a mystery of disputed depth, researchers unable to agree on what their own instruments detected, the site we turn to now offers no such ambiguity about what's there. It can be seen clearly, even from above, and has been mapped, surveyed, and photographed extensively. What remains unresolved is everything about why it exists. On the volcanic plateau of the Golan Heights, a territory whose sovereignty remains internationally contested, and whose modern status involves disputed claims and competing administrations, an enormous stone structure spreads across the landscape in a pattern so geometrically deliberate that early aerial surveys initially struggled to believe it was prehistoric at all. It is known as Rujm el-Hiri, sometimes called Gilgal Rephaim, and it consists of more than 42,000 basalt rocks arranged into concentric circles, the outermost ring stretching roughly 150 meters in diameter, with a stone cairn at the very center rising several meters high. The structure was first documented through aerial photography in the 1960s, though serious archaeological investigation didn't begin in earnest until the 1980s, when teams led by researchers including Jonathan Mizrachi conducted systematic excavation and surveying across multiple seasons. What they confirmed was a structure of remarkable scale and complexity. 5 concentric stone walls, the outermost measuring roughly 2 meters in height and over 3 meters thick in places, with the rings connected by what excavators identified as radial spokes. Shorter stone walls linking the circles together at various points, creating a layout that, viewed from above, bears a striking resemblance to a wheel, which is reflected in its Arabic name, Rujm el-Hiri, generally translated as stone heap of the wild cat, while its Hebrew name, Gilgal Rephaim, carries the more evocative translation, Wheel of Giants, a name tied to regional folklore referencing the Rephaim, a people described in ancient texts of the region as giants, or a vanished legendary population. Radiocarbon dating and archaeological analysis place the structure's construction within the early Bronze Age, generally estimated at some time around 3000 to 2700 BC, making it roughly contemporary with some of the earliest dynastic construction in Egypt and predating Stonehenge's most famous stone phases by several centuries. What makes this dating particularly puzzling is the apparent absence of any substantial, permanent settlement in the immediate surrounding area large enough to explain the labor required to move and arrange more than 42,000 stones, some individually weighing several tons, into such a precise and extensive formation. Unlike many megalithic sites built near population centers whose residents would have provided the necessary workforce, Rujm el-Hiri sits in a location that archaeological surveys suggest was sparsely inhabited at the time of its construction, raising the still unresolved question of where exactly the labor force came from and why this particular remote plateau location was chosen for a project of this magnitude. The mainstream archaeological position generally interprets Rujm el-Hiri as a ceremonial or ritual site, likely connected to astronomical observation, ancestor worship, or burial practices, though the specific combination and priority of these functions remains genuinely debated among researchers who've studied the site closely. The central cairn, when excavated, was found to contain a burial chamber, though notably, the human remains recovered from within dated to a period significantly later than the structure's main construction phase, suggesting the burial itself may represent a secondary use of the site by a later culture, repurposing an already ancient monument for funerary purposes rather than reflecting its original intended function. A pattern of layered use across vastly different time periods that echoes similar questions raised at sites like the Osireion, where later additions complicate confident interpretation of original purpose. The astronomical dimension of Rujm el-Hiri has drawn particular scholarly attention, grounded in measurable, testable evidence rather than pure speculation. Researchers, including astronomer Anthony Aveni, working alongside archaeologist Jonathan Mizrachi, conducted detailed analysis of the site's alignments and found that specific gaps and openings within the concentric walls correspond with notable precision to the rising points of the sun on the summer solstice, as it would have appeared from the central cairn around the time of the structure's construction, a finding that has been generally well received within the archaeological community as evidence the site served, at least in part, a deliberate astronomical or calendrical function, helping ancient observers track and mark the changing seasons with a level of precision typically associated with much later, more developed civilizations. This astronomical evidence, however solid, doesn't fully account for the structure's most unusual feature: its sheer, almost excessive scale relative to what astronomical observation alone would typically require. A solstice marker doesn't generally necessitate 42,000 carefully arranged stones, forming 5 concentric rings connected by radial walls, a level of architectural complexity that has led some researchers to propose the site may have served multiple overlapping purposes simultaneously, functioning as an astronomical observatory, a ceremonial gathering space for a regional population that converged on the plateau periodically rather than living there permanently, and, eventually, a burial site repurposed by a later culture that recognized, and perhaps still understood on some level, the original site's significance. Beyond these archaeologically grounded interpretations, the site's evocative name and remote, dramatic setting have inevitably attracted more speculative attention as well, with some alternative researchers proposing connections to ancient folklore traditions referenced in regional texts, including stories of a vanished people of unusual size or strength once said to have inhabited the wider region. Interpretations that mainstream archaeology generally treats as cultural memory or symbolic naming convention attached after the fact, rather than literal evidence regarding the structure's actual builders, who remain, in any concrete archaeological sense, entirely unidentified by name or specific cultural affiliation. Adding a further layer of difficulty to ongoing research is the site's location within a politically sensitive and historically contested region, where access, excavation permits, and sustained long-term archaeological investment have at various points been complicated by the broader political situation surrounding the Golan Heights, a factor that has, by the assessment of several researchers involved in the site's study, limited the pace and continuity of investigation compared to what a site of this scale and significance might otherwise receive in a less contested location. Stand at the center of Rujm el-Hiri today, beside the ancient burial cairn, and look outward across 5 concentric rings of stone stretching toward the horizon in every direction. More than 42,000 individual rocks placed with evident, careful intention by hands whose names and origins have vanished entirely from the historical record. The sun still rises, on the solstice, through the same gap in the same wall it was apparently designed to pass through nearly 5,000 years ago. Proof that someone, here, on this remote plateau, understood the sky well enough to build a monument that still works. What they understood about everything else, about death, about gathering, about whatever ceremony once drew a population together on this scale, in this specific isolated place, remains locked inside a wheel of stone that has outlasted every civilization that might have explained it. If Rujm el-Hiri is a mystery of stones whose purpose remains debated despite full visibility, the site we turn to now submerges that same uncertainty beneath the waves, where visibility itself becomes part of the challenge. Off the southern coast of Yonaguni, the westernmost inhabited island in Japan's Ryukyu archipelago, divers descending into the cool Pacific waters encounter something that has divided geologists and archaeologists for more than 3 decades. A massive underwater rock formation, rising from the seafloor at depths between roughly 5 and 25 meters, composed of sharp, angular terraces, flat platforms, and what appear to be carved steps, stretching across an area roughly 150 meters long and 40 meters wide. It is known as the Yonaguni Monument, and the central question surrounding it, natural formation or human construction, has never been definitively settled. The formation was discovered in 1986 by Kihachiro Aratake, a local diver exploring the waters off Yonaguni's southern coast in search of hammerhead sharks, a popular local attraction. What he found instead was a structure so geometrically striking: straight edges, distinct right angles, terraced levels connected by what looked like deliberate stairways, that it quickly drew the attention of researchers and, soon after, considerable international media interest. Among the most prominent academic investigators to take the formation seriously was Masaki Kimura, a marine geologist at the University of the Ryukyus, who has spent decades studying the site and has consistently argued that the formation shows clear evidence of human modification, including what he identifies as a carved staircase, a feature resembling a stone road, and even markings he interprets as possible carved imagery of animals, all of which, in his assessment, point to deliberate construction by an unknown ancient civilization, at a time when the site would necessarily have been above sea level for such construction to have occurred at all. This last point is what makes the Yonaguni Monument so significant and so contested within the broader study of ancient history. Given the site's current depth beneath the surface, any deliberate human construction would have needed to take place before rising sea levels following the last ice age submerged the area, a transition that occurred roughly between 10,000 and 6,000 BC, depending on the specific region and local geological conditions. If Kimura's interpretation is correct, the Yonaguni Monument would represent evidence of organized monumental stone construction from a period significantly predating not only the pyramids of Egypt, but also Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, currently among the oldest confirmed monumental structures in the world. A claim that, if substantiated, would carry implications for the broader historical timeline of human civilization comparable to the most extreme claims surrounding Gunung Padang. The mainstream geological position, held by the majority of researchers who have examined the site, including geologist Robert Shah, who has dived the formation directly and published assessments of it, takes a considerably more conservative view. Under this interpretation, the Yonaguni Monument's striking geometric features are the product of entirely natural processes, specifically the way the local sandstone, layered with distinct bedding planes, fractures along straight, consistent lines when subjected to the kind of tectonic stress and wave erosion common in this seismically active region of the Pacific. This type of fracturing, similar in principle to the natural columnar jointing that produces the Kaimanawa Wall's deceptively masonry-like appearance in New Zealand, can plausibly account for sharp angles, flat terraces, and even step-like formations, without requiring any human intervention at all. Critics of the artificial origin theory also point to the absence of conclusively identified, unambiguous tool marks, the lack of any portable artifacts recovered from the site itself, such as pottery or carved objects that would typically accompany ancient human activity, and the broader geological context of the surrounding seafloor, which features other natural rock formations nearby, exhibiting similar angular characteristics without any contested claims of human construction attached to them. Between these two positions sits a body of evidence that has never quite resolved the disagreement in either direction. Proponents of the artificial origin theory point to specific features that they argue exceed what natural fracturing alone would typically produce. Among them, two large, closely spaced holes carved into one section of the formation, which Kimura has suggested may have served as part of a quarrying technique, similar to methods documented at certain ancient quarry sites elsewhere in the world, where stone blocks were extracted by drilling holes and applying wedges to split rock along controlled lines. Critics counter that similar paired hole formations can occur naturally through differential erosion and dissolution processes in sedimentary rock, though they generally acknowledge this particular feature is among the more genuinely ambiguous elements of the site, harder to dismiss outright than some other claimed evidence. Further complicating the debate is the matter of nearby formations nearer the surface, including what local diving guides have long referred to as a structure resembling a turtle, and other features some have interpreted as carved or arranged stones suggestive of ceremonial use. Interpretations that remain firmly in the realm of speculation, lacking the kind of systematic measurement and analysis applied to the main terraced formation itself. What both sides of the debate generally agree on is that significant portions of the broader Yonaguni site remain incompletely surveyed, given the practical challenges of underwater archaeological investigation, including limited dive times, water clarity that varies considerably with season and current, and the sheer scale of seafloor terrain surrounding the main formation that has not yet received the same intensive scrutiny as the central terraced structure. This incomplete survey record means that, more than 3 decades after its initial discovery, neither position has been able to produce the kind of conclusive, widely accepted physical evidence, clear tool marks under controlled examination, recovered artifacts in secure context, or, conversely, an unambiguous geological match to known natural fracture patterns in directly comparable formations that would be needed to settle the matter definitively for the broader scientific community. The dispute has, if anything, hardened along largely consistent lines over the years, with Kimura and a small number of other researchers continuing to advocate for human construction based on their direct, extensive fieldwork at the site, while the majority of mainstream geologists and archaeologists maintain that natural processes remain the more parsimonious and evidentially supported explanation, particularly given the absence of corroborating artifacts that would typically accompany a site of this proposed scale and significance. Descend today into the clear waters off Yonaguni's southern coast, and the formation rises out of the blue with an undeniable, almost theatrical geometry. Sharp terraces stacked like the steps of a building, flat platforms wide enough to imagine standing on, angles too clean to dismiss at first glance, yet not quite clean enough, according to most geologists, to demand a human explanation either. Somewhere between Kimura's carved staircase and Shok's fractured sandstone lies the unresolved truth of this place. Sitting quietly beneath the waves it has occupied for thousands of years. Regardless of which explanation eventually proves correct, and regardless of how much longer the rest of this submerged terrain remains, quite literally unexplored. If the Yonaguni Monument is a mystery hidden beneath the surface of the ocean, the site we turn to now is its inverse in almost every way. A formation so enormous that it cannot be properly seen from the ground at all, only fully understood from space, and so geologically improbable that for decades, even satellites couldn't entirely settle what it actually was. In the remote Adrar Plateau of Mauritania, in the heart of the Sahara Desert, a vast concentric ring formation spreads across the landscape, roughly 40 kilometers in diameter, its layered rock visible to astronauts aboard early orbital missions long before most geologists had even identified it from the ground. It is known as the Richat Structure, though it has earned a more evocative nickname in recent decades, the Eye of the Sahara. The formation consists of a series of nearly perfect concentric rings, composed of differentially eroded sedimentary and igneous rock, creating a bullseye pattern so symmetrical that, when first photographed from orbit during the early Gemini and Apollo space missions in the 1960s, astronauts reportedly used it as a visual landmark, given its distinctiveness against the otherwise relatively featureless expanse of the surrounding desert. Its dramatic visibility from space, combined with its considerable size, made it one of the most recognizable geological features on Earth, long before its formation process was properly understood by the scientific community studying it. For years following its initial documentation, the Richat Structure's origin remained a genuine open question even among geologists, with early hypotheses proposing it might be the result of a massive meteorite impact, an explanation that would have accounted for both its scale and its strikingly circular symmetry, drawing comparison to known impact craters elsewhere in the world. This impact theory held considerable currency for a period, given how naturally it seemed to explain the formation's most visually striking characteristic. Subsequent, more detailed geological fieldwork, however, gradually shifted scientific consensus toward a different explanation. Detailed analysis of the rock layers, conducted by geologists examining both surface samples and the formation's broader structural composition, found no evidence of the shock-metamorphosed rock or the characteristic impact-related mineral deformation that would be expected at a genuine meteorite strike site of this scale. Instead, researchers identified evidence consistent with what's known as a deeply eroded geological dome, formed through a combination of igneous intrusion, molten rock pushing upward from deep within the Earth's crust without ever fully breaching the surface, and subsequent, sustained erosion over an extraordinarily long geological timescale, which gradually exposed the dome's internal layered structure, creating the concentric ring pattern visible today. Current geological consensus places the structure's formation within a complex sequence of events spanning hundreds of millions of years, with the underlying igneous activity dated to the Cretaceous period and earlier, and the visible ring pattern itself being the product of differential erosion, acting on rock layers of varying hardness and composition, with softer layers eroding more readily than harder ones, gradually carving out the distinctive rings as the dome was slowly worn down from above. This geological explanation is now broadly accepted within the scientific community, supported by extensive fieldwork and rock sampling that has largely ruled out the impact hypothesis in favor of the eroded dome model. And yet, the Richat Structure's sheer visual improbability, combined with its remote, inhospitable desert location far from any major population center, has continued to draw attention well beyond strictly geological interest, particularly as the formation's profile has grown through increasingly detailed satellite imagery available to the public over the past 2 decades. Some of this continued attention has taken a more speculative turn, most notably through proposals connecting the Richat Structure to the lost city of Atlantis, an idea most prominently advanced by independent researcher Michael Howard, who has argued that the structure's concentric ring pattern bears a notable resemblance to ancient descriptions, originating with the Greek philosopher Plato of Atlantis as a city built with alternating rings of land and water surrounding a central island. Under this interpretation, the Richat Structure's current desert setting wouldn't necessarily contradict the theory, given that the broader Sahara region is known to have undergone dramatic climatic shifts over the past several thousand years, transitioning from a notably wetter, more habitable green Sahara period, well documented through paleoclimate and archaeological evidence, into the arid desert landscape that exists today, raising the question, within this more speculative framework, of whether a structure with this shape, situated in a region that was once considerably more hospitable, might have held some significance, even if not literally constructed by ancient hands, to early human populations who would have encountered such a strikingly geometric natural feature. This Atlantis connection remains firmly outside mainstream archaeology and geology, with most researchers in both fields pointing out that the established geological dating of the Richat Structure's formation predates any plausible human habitation of the region by many millions of years, making a direct connection to Plato's relatively specific, comparatively recent narrative description difficult to reconcile with the established timeline, regardless of the formation's visual resemblance to his description. Mainstream researchers generally treat the resemblance as a striking coincidence of natural geological symmetry, rather than evidence of any genuine historical connection. What keeps the Richat Structure positioned at this intersection of settled geology and persistent speculation isn't necessarily mystery surrounding the formation's actual creation, which is now reasonably well understood and supported by solid fieldwork, but rather the more open-ended question of how and whether this remarkable natural landmark may have factored into the lives, movement, and cultural memory of the human populations who did inhabit the broader Sahara region during its more verdant, habitable periods. Archaeological surveys across the wider Sahara have confirmed extensive evidence of human settlement during the Green Sahara period, roughly 11,000 to 5,000 years ago, including rock art, tool assemblages, and other material culture documenting communities that thrived in a landscape vastly different from today's desert. Whether any of these populations specifically encountered, recognized, or attached significance to the Richat Structure's dramatic ring pattern during this more hospitable period remains an open question that the geological record alone cannot answer, since that kind of cultural or symbolic significance, if it existed at all, would have left behind a very different and much harder to find kind of evidence. View the Richat Structure today, whether through satellite imagery or, for the few who make the difficult journey, from the ground itself, where its full symmetry becomes far harder to perceive than from above, and the formation offers a different kind of mystery than most of the sites explored throughout this investigation. Not a structure whose origin defies explanation, but a landscape whose meaning, if it ever had one beyond the geological, has been worn away as thoroughly as the rock itself, leaving behind only the eye-like pattern, staring up at the same empty desert sky it has watched in silence for longer than human history has existed to observe it. If the Richat Structure is a mystery resolved by geology but left open by questions of human meaning, the site we turn to now reverses that balance entirely. Here, there is no doubt whatsoever that human hands were responsible. Only an enduring uncertainty about why they worked on such an almost incomprehensible scale. Along the southern coast of Brittany, in northwestern France, near the small town of Carnac, the landscape is filled, for kilometers in every direction, with standing stones, not scattered individually, as at many megalithic sites elsewhere in Europe, but arranged in long, deliberate rows, thousands of them, marching across fields and through forests in formations whose full extent still isn't completely mapped. They are known as the Carnac Stones, and they constitute by a wide margin the largest collection of standing stones anywhere in the world. The numbers alone are difficult to fully absorb. Estimates suggest the original alignments may have included as many as 10,000 to 11,000 individual standing stones, known as menhirs, though only a portion of that original number survives today, with roughly 3,000 stones remaining in their alignments across the main sites, organized into three principal stone fields: Menek, Kermario, and Kerlesken, each consisting of multiple parallel rows, stretching in some sections for well over a kilometer. The stones themselves vary considerably in height, from smaller examples under a meter tall to massive menhirs exceeding 6 meters, generally arranged with a noticeable pattern of decreasing height from one end of a given row to the other, a deliberate gradation that has long struck researchers as evidence of careful planning rather than incidental placement. Archaeological dating places the bulk of construction within the Neolithic period, with the earliest alignments generally estimated to have been erected sometime around 4500 to 3300 BC, making the Carnac stones considerably older than Stonehenge's most famous Trilithon phase, and roughly contemporary with the broader wave of megalithic construction that swept across Atlantic Europe during this period, connecting Carnac, in a loose cultural and technological sense, to other sites explored throughout this investigation, including the cup and ring carvings of the Cochno Stone and the temple traditions of Malta. Excavations throughout the surrounding region have also uncovered numerous burial mounds, known as tumuli, along with dolmens and other megalithic chamber tombs, confirming that the broader Carnac area served as a significant ceremonial and funerary landscape across an extended period of Neolithic activity, not merely the site of the standing stone alignments alone. What has never been definitively settled, despite more than 2 centuries of formal archaeological study beginning in the early 19th century, is the specific purpose behind the alignments themselves. Why a Neolithic society would commit the immense, sustained labor required to quarry, transport, and erect thousands of stones, some weighing many tons, into rows stretching for kilometers across the landscape, rather than concentrating that effort into more compact, singular monuments, as seen at most other megalithic sites of comparable age elsewhere in Europe. The most widely supported archaeological theory connects the alignments to ritual and ceremonial use, possibly functioning as processional routes, with the rows of stones marking pathways used during seasonal rites, ancestor veneration ceremonies, or other communal religious practices tied to the surrounding burial monuments, suggesting a landscape designed for movement and gathering rather than static observation alone. This interpretation finds support in the alignment's proximity to numerous burial sites and in comparable, though smaller scale, processional stone arrangements documented at other Neolithic sites across Europe, lending the theory reasonable contextual grounding even without direct textual or pictorial evidence specifying the alignment's exact ceremonial function. A second major line of research has focused on potential astronomical significance, an investigation most notably advanced by British astronomer and engineer Alexander Thom, who conducted detailed surveys of Carnac and numerous other British and French megalithic sites throughout the mid-20th century. Thom proposed that certain stones and alignments at Carnac corresponded with notable precision to lunar and solar observations, including potential markers for solstices and more complex lunar cycle tracking, suggesting the builders possessed a sophisticated, systematic understanding of astronomical movement that they encoded directly into the landscape itself. Tom's broader work, including his proposed megalithic yard, a standardized unit of measurement he argued was used consistently across numerous megalithic sites throughout Britain and France, has remained influential but also contested within archaeology, with some researchers embracing his astronomical alignments as compelling evidence of advanced Neolithic knowledge, while others argue that, much as with claimed alignments at other sites explored throughout this investigation, the sheer number of stones spread across such an extensive area makes some degree of apparent astronomical correspondence statistically likely to occur by chance alone, rather than necessarily reflecting deliberate design across the entire alignment system. Beyond these two major lines of mainstream interpretation, the sheer scale of labor required for the alignments has prompted ongoing discussion about the social organization necessary to accomplish such a project. Quarrying, transporting, and erecting thousands of stones, some sourced from locations several kilometers from their final placement, would have required a sustained, coordinated workforce operating over what was likely an extended period, possibly spanning many generations, implying a level of social complexity, communal cooperation, or centralized organizational capacity among Neolithic communities in the region that exceeds what's typically assumed for societies of this era and scale elsewhere in prehistoric Europe. A logistical puzzle that echoes similar open questions raised by the labor demands evident at the Plain of Jars and the stone spheres of Costa Rica. Local legend, much like at several other sites explored throughout this investigation, has offered its own explanation, persisting in regional folklore for centuries, that the stones represent Roman soldiers, turned to stone by the wizard Merlin during his pursuit through the region, a story tied to Brittany's deep association with Arthurian legend and folklore traditions. Archaeologists treat this account, predictably, as folklore layered onto the monument long after its original Neolithic purpose had faded from cultural memory, rather than evidence bearing on the stone's actual origin or function. Though, as with comparable legends attached to Aramu Muru and the Plain of Jars, its persistence reflects how thoroughly a monument this strange and ancient can embed itself into a region's storytelling, independent of whatever its original builders intended. Walk the long rows at Kermario or Menek today, early in the morning before the crowds arrive, with mist still settling low across the Breton fields, and the stones stretch out ahead in a procession that seems to resist any single, tidy explanation, their gradually diminishing heights leading the eye toward a horizon that offers no further clarification. Were they a path for the living, walked during ceremonies now entirely forgotten? A calendar written in stone and shadow, tracking a sky whose movements once governed an entire community's sense of time. Or something else altogether, requiring a scale of cooperation and purpose that Neolithic Brittany has never fully been credited with achieving. After more than 2 centuries of study, the rows remain standing, exactly as deliberate and exactly as silent as the day the last stone was set. If the Carnac Stones are a mystery of stone set in deliberate rows across the French countryside, the site we turn to now trades stone for earth, and rows for something closer to a vanished metropolis, hidden in plain sight in the American heartland. Just east of present-day St. Louis, Missouri, across the Mississippi River in southwestern Illinois, the flat agricultural land of the American Bottom region is punctuated by enormous earthen mounds, the largest of which rises 10 stories above the surrounding floodplain, covering a footprint larger at its base than the Great Pyramid of Giza. This is Cahokia, and at its peak, it was the largest city north of Mexico in the pre-Columbian Americas, a fact that surprises many who encounter it for the first time, given how little it tends to feature in the broader popular narrative of North American history. Cahokia's central feature is Monk's Mound, named for a group of Trappist monks who briefly settled near its base in the early 19th century, long after the site's original builders had departed. Rising roughly 30 meters in height and covering an area of approximately 6 hectares at its base, Monk's Mound stands as the largest pre-Columbian earthen construction in the Americas, built in stages over several centuries through the careful, deliberate transport of an estimated 14 million cubic feet of earth, moved entirely by hand, in woven baskets, without the benefit of wheeled carts or draft animals, which were not present in pre-Columbian North America. Monk's Mound is only the largest of more than 120 mounds that once made up the broader Cahokia complex, with roughly 80 surviving today within the protected boundaries of Cahokia Mounds State Historic Site, a designated UNESCO World Heritage location since 1982. Archaeological consensus, built on decades of careful excavation, places Cahokia's growth and peak between approximately 1050 and 1200 AD, a period during which the city's population is estimated, based on settlement density and structural evidence, to have reached somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 residents, with some estimates extending higher when accounting for the broader surrounding settlement area, making Cahokia, at its height, comparable in population to contemporary European cities such as London, a comparison that consistently surprises those encountering the site's scale for the first time, given how rarely Cahokia features in broader popular narratives of medieval-era urban history. The city's layout reveals a level of planning and social organization that archaeologists have worked for decades to fully reconstruct. Excavations have identified a large, deliberately leveled plaza adjacent to Monk's Mound, evidence of a massive wooden post circle dubbed Woodhenge by researchers, believed to have served calendrical or astronomical functions tracking solstices and equinoxes through carefully aligned sight lines, and extensive residential districts radiating outward from the ceremonial center, along with evidence of long-distance trade connections, with materials recovered at the site originating from sources as distant as the Gulf Coast, the Great Lakes region, and the Rocky Mountains, indicating Cahokia functioned as a significant hub within an extensive North American trade network during its peak period. What has never been fully resolved, despite this substantial body of archaeological evidence, are two of the most fundamental questions surrounding the city. Precisely how its complex social and political structure functioned, given the absence of any written record from its builders, and, more strikingly, why such a large, apparently thriving urban center experienced a comparatively rapid decline and eventual abandonment, with most archaeological evidence suggesting the site was largely depopulated by around 1350 to 1400 AD, well before European contact with the region. Several theories have been proposed to explain Cahokia's decline, each supported by varying degrees of physical evidence, without any single explanation having achieved full scholarly consensus. Environmental factors feature prominently in current research, with evidence of deforestation across the surrounding region, likely driven by the immense timber demands of sustained construction and fuel needs for a population this size, potentially contributing to soil erosion, flooding, and reduced agricultural productivity in the floodplain environment the city depended on for food production. Climate data drawn from regional tree ring and sediment analysis also points to a period of increased flooding and climatic instability coinciding with Cahokia's decline, suggesting environmental stress may have placed unsustainable pressure on the city's agricultural base, a theory broadly comparable to environmental collapse explanations proposed for other complex pre-modern societies elsewhere in the world. Alongside environmental pressures, some archaeologists have proposed social and political instability as a contributing or even primary factor, pointing to evidence of increased fortification, including a wooden stockade wall surrounding the central ceremonial precinct, constructed and subsequently rebuilt multiple times during the city's later occupation, suggesting periods of internal conflict, external threat, or both, that may have placed increasing strain on the social cohesion necessary to sustain a population and ceremonial infrastructure of this scale over the long term. A further, more somber line of archaeological evidence concerns mass burials uncovered at Cahokia, most notably within Mound 72, a smaller ridgetop mound where excavations uncovered the remains of more than 270 individuals, including a small number buried with elaborate grave goods suggesting high status, alongside larger groups showing evidence consistent with ritual sacrifice, a practice documented at various complex societies elsewhere in the pre-Columbian Americas, though its specific scale and significance within Cahokia's social and religious structure remains a subject of careful, ongoing interpretation, given how much about the city's belief systems and social hierarchy must necessarily be inferred from burial evidence alone, in the complete absence of any surviving written record from Cahokia's own residents. This absence of written history is in many ways the central challenge underlying every open question about Cahokia. Everything known about the city's governance, its religious practices, its relationship with surrounding and distant communities, and the specific circumstances of its decline has been pieced together entirely through material evidence, recovered patiently over more than a century of excavation, without the benefit of a single surviving textual account from the people who actually built and lived within it, leaving substantial room for legitimate scholarly disagreement on questions that a single surviving document might otherwise have settled definitively. Stand today atop Monk's Mound, looking out across the flat floodplain toward the distant St. Louis skyline, and the scale of what once stood here becomes difficult to reconcile with how quietly Cahokia has slipped from broader public memory. A city larger than London, raised entirely from hand-carried earth, organized around astronomical observation and a thriving network of distant trade, populated by tens of thousands, and then, within a few generations, largely emptied, its reasons for both its rise and its fall left to be reconstructed, piece by careful piece, from soil, post holes, and the silent testimony of its dead. What exactly broke first, the land, the social order, or something else entirely that the evidence has not yet revealed, remains a question the mounds themselves have kept, for now, to the earth they were made from. If Cahokia is a mystery built on a foundation of overwhelming, carefully excavated physical evidence with unanswered questions layered on top, the case we turn to now inverts that structure almost entirely, a claimed discovery with almost no verifiable physical evidence at all, and a story whose central mystery may have less to do with ancient history than with the man who told it. In 1982, in rural Olney, Illinois, a local resident named Russell Burrows claimed to have stumbled upon a hidden cave system while exploring his property. A cave, he said, was filled with hundreds of inscribed stone tablets and artifacts bearing what he described as ancient writing systems, carved portraits, and imagery unlike anything documented elsewhere in North American archaeology. He called it, simply, Burrows Cave. And the story that grew around it over the following decades has remained, since its very first telling, almost entirely unverifiable. According to Burrows's account, the cave contained thousands of artifacts, including stone tablets engraved with what he and a small circle of supporters interpreted as ancient Mediterranean scripts, including possible Phoenician, Egyptian hieroglyphic style, and even Latin-adjacent characters, along with carved stone heads depicting figures with what some interpreters described as distinctly non-Native American features, including beards and headwear unlike anything documented among known pre-Columbian indigenous cultures of the region. If genuine, these artifacts would suggest direct contact between ancient Mediterranean or Old World civilizations and North America, occurring many centuries, and by some interpretations even millennia, before the commonly accepted timeline of European contact with the Americas, beginning with Norse exploration around 1000 AD and followed by Spanish contact after 1492. This is precisely the kind of claim that, if substantiated through rigorous, independently verified archaeological methodology, would represent one of the most significant discoveries in the history of American archaeology, fundamentally reshaping understanding of pre-Columbian contact and cultural exchange. It is also precisely the kind of claim that demands an unusually high standard of evidence before being treated as established fact, given how directly it would contradict an extensive, independently corroborated body of existing archaeological, genetic, and linguistic evidence regarding the timeline and nature of human movement into and across the Americas. That standard of evidence has never been met. Despite more than 4 decades since Burrows' initial claim, the cave's precise location has never been disclosed publicly or made available for independent archaeological excavation, with Burrows offering shifting, often vague explanations over the years for why the site couldn't be revisited or verified by outside researchers, including claims that the entrance had become unstable, inaccessible, or that he wished to protect it from looting. No professional archaeologist has ever been permitted to conduct a controlled excavation at the claimed site, and no artifact attributed to the cave has ever undergone publicly documented, peer-reviewed scientific dating or authentication through an independent laboratory using methods that would satisfy standard archaeological verification protocols. What does exist is a substantial private collection of stone artifacts, photographs, and casts attributed to the cave, circulated for decades primarily within fringe and alternative history circles, along with self-published materials and limited media coverage, most notably a segment that aired on the television program Unsolved Mysteries in the early 1990s, which brought the story to a considerably wider public audience than it had previously reached. This media attention, however, did not translate into the kind of independent scientific scrutiny that would be necessary to evaluate the claims on solid archaeological footing, leaving the case in a state where public fascination has consistently outpaced verifiable evidence. The professional archaeological and historical community's assessment of Burrows Cave has been, with very few exceptions, decisively skeptical, bordering on outright dismissal. Researchers who have examined available photographs and artifact casts have pointed to inconsistencies in the inscribed scripts that don't correspond cleanly to any single known ancient writing system, instead appearing, to several linguists and epigraphers who have reviewed the material, to blend elements from multiple distinct, geographically and historically unrelated ancient scripts in ways that genuine ancient artifacts would be extremely unlikely to exhibit, suggesting fabrication by someone with partial, second-hand familiarity with several different ancient writing traditions rather than authentic ancient inscription by a single historical culture. Further scrutiny has focused on stylistic inconsistencies in the carved stone heads themselves, with several researchers noting similarities to widely available reference imagery and museum reproductions of ancient Mediterranean art that could plausibly have served as visual templates for modern forgery. Compounding these specific artifact-level concerns is the broader, more fundamental problem of access and verification that has defined the case from the beginning. A discovery of this purported historical magnitude, if genuine, would ordinarily be expected to generate sustained, methodical scientific interest and access over more than 4 decades, rather than remaining permanently shielded from independent excavation by a single individual's discretion. This pattern, extraordinary claims paired with persistent, unresolved inaccessibility to independent verification, is one that professional archaeologists generally regard as a significant warning sign, distinguishing claims like Burrows Cave from genuinely unresolved archaeological questions, such as those surrounding sites like Gunung Padang or the Yonaguni Monument, where the underlying physical sites themselves remain fully accessible to ongoing, independent scientific study, even if their ultimate interpretation continues to be debated. Russell Burrows passed away in 2018, having maintained his account of the cave's existence and contents until the end of his life, without ever disclosing the location to archaeological authorities or permitting a controlled, independently documented excavation. The substantial private collection of artifacts attributed to the cave remains scattered among collectors and enthusiasts, with no comprehensive, centralized scientific study ever having been conducted on the full body of claimed material under controlled, peer-reviewed conditions. What remains, more than 4 decades after the initial claim, is a case that sits in a notably different category than most of the sites explored throughout this investigation. Not a physically verified location whose interpretation remains genuinely contested among credentialed researchers, but an account that has never advanced beyond the testimony of the man who first told it, supported by artifacts that have drawn considerable scholarly skepticism and never undergone the kind of independent verification that would be required to settle the matter. Whether Burrows Cave represents a deliberate fabrication, an honest discovery clouded by decades of poor documentation and understandable caution, or something in between, the central, defining fact of the case is this: somewhere in rural Illinois, according to one man's account, an extraordinary cave still waits to be found, and in the more than 40 years since he first described it, no one else has ever been allowed to look. If Burrows Cave is a mystery undermined by the absence of access, the site we turn to now offers the opposite condition entirely: full, continuous public access for nearly 3 centuries, a precisely known location beneath an ordinary English market town, and still, after all that scrutiny, no settled answer for who carved it or why. In Royston, Hertfordshire, at the crossroads of 2 ancient routes, Icknield Way and Ermine Street, both used since prehistoric and Roman times, a narrow shaft descends beneath the town's market square into a bell-shaped chamber, its walls covered, almost floor to ceiling, with an extraordinary and unusual collection of carved figures, symbols, and religious imagery. It is known as Royston Cave, and unlike Burrows Cave, its physical existence has never been in question. What remains genuinely unresolved is almost everything else about it. The cave was discovered by accident in August 1742, when workmen repairing a bench in the town's market square broke through a buried millstone covering a hidden shaft, leading down into a chamber that had, by all available evidence, lain sealed and largely forgotten for an extended, though still debated, period of time. The chamber itself is roughly bell-shaped, cut directly into the underlying chalk bedrock, standing approximately 8 meters tall and 4.5 meters in diameter at its widest point, with its lower wall smoothed and its upper section densely covered in carved relief work depicting an unusually eclectic mix of figures. Images interpreted as Saint Christopher, Saint Catherine with her associated wheel, and the crucifixion, alongside more unusual and harder to classify imagery, including a horse, a heart pierced or marked with symbols, and several figures whose specific identification has remained genuinely contested among researchers who've studied the carvings closely over the centuries since the cave's rediscovery. What's relatively well established, based on stylistic analysis of the carving techniques and the religious iconography present, is that the bulk of the carved imagery dates broadly to the medieval period, with most researchers placing the primary carving work sometime within the 13th to 14th centuries, a period that situates the cave's creation within England's broader medieval Christian religious context. What's considerably less settled is the question of who specifically carved the imagery and what original purpose the chamber itself served before it became a canvas for that religious artwork. The leading theory, and the one most consistently advanced since serious modern academic study of the cave began, connects Royston Cave to the Knights Templar, the medieval Christian military order whose extensive landholdings and activities across England during the 12th and 13th centuries are well documented through surviving historical records, including evidence the Templars held property and influence in the broader Hertfordshire region during this period. Proponents of this theory point to several specific carved figures that they interpret as bearing iconography consistent with Templar symbolism and practice, including a figure some researchers have identified as representing Saint Catherine in a manner stylistically associated with Templar veneration, and broader compositional elements that, in this interpretation, suggest the chamber may have functioned as a secluded site for private devotion, ritual, or even initiation practices connected to the order, away from the more public, formal religious spaces of the town above. This Templar connection, while widely repeated and taken seriously by a number of credentialed historians who've studied the site, has never achieved full scholarly consensus and remains, even among those generally sympathetic to the theory, more an informed interpretation than a definitively proven attribution. Critics and more cautious researchers have pointed out that the specific iconographic evidence cited in support of Templar involvement is open to alternative interpretation, given that many of the carved figures, including the saints and the crucifixion imagery, reflect broadly common medieval Christian devotional themes that would have been entirely consistent with use by other religious orders or lay devotional groups active in the region during the same general period, without necessarily requiring specific Templar involvement to explain their presence. Compounding the difficulty of resolving the cave's original purpose and builders is the deeper, more fundamental uncertainty surrounding the chamber's earliest origins, prior to its known medieval decorative phase. Some researchers and local historians have proposed that the cave's underlying bell-shaped excavation may significantly predate its medieval carvings, potentially originating as an Iron Age or even earlier chalk extraction site, or possibly serving some now unknown function tied to Royston's documented position at the ancient crossroads of Icknield Way and Ermine Street, locations with their own separate histories of prehistoric and Roman-era use and significance. Under this interpretation, the medieval carvings represent a later religious reuse and adornment of an already existing, considerably older excavated space, rather than the chamber's original construction, a layered use pattern echoing similar questions raised about deeper, possibly earlier construction phases at sites like the Osireion and, more controversially, Gunung Padang. This earlier origin theory, however, like the Templar attribution, remains difficult to confirm definitively, given the limited archaeological excavation that has been conducted beneath and around the chamber's lower sections, where any conclusive physical evidence of its earliest use phase would most likely be found. The question of why the chamber was ultimately sealed, and for how long it remained hidden before its accidental 1742 rediscovery, has also generated ongoing discussion without full resolution. Some historians have proposed the cave may have been deliberately sealed following the dramatic and well-documented suppression of the Knights Templar across Europe in the early 14th century, when the order was officially dissolved and its members faced arrest, trial, and in many cases execution, under coordinated pressure from both the Catholic Church and several European monarchies. Under this theory, sealing the chamber would have represented a deliberate act of concealment, protecting a sensitive devotional or ceremonial space from discovery during a period of intense persecution directed at anyone associated with the order. This explanation, while compelling and chronologically plausible given the broader historical timeline, remains circumstantial, without direct documentary evidence specifically describing the chamber's ceiling or the motivations behind it. Today, Royston Cave remains open to the public, managed and preserved by a local charitable trust, allowing visitors to descend the same narrow shaft first reopened in 1742 and stand beneath carvings that have now been studied, debated, and photographed for nearly 3 centuries, without ever yielding a fully agreed-upon explanation. Unlike Burrows Cave, there is no question here of access, location, or verified physical existence. Every uncertainty surrounding Royston Cave concerns interpretation rather than evidence itself, a distinction that has done little in nearly 300 years of continuous study to bring the matter any closer to resolution. Who knelt in this chamber, carving saints and symbols into chalk by candlelight, and what exactly they were protecting, devoted to, or hiding from remains a question the cave has kept, quite literally, sealed beneath the everyday foot traffic of an English market town that has walked above it, largely unaware, for longer than anyone has been able to fully explain what lies beneath their feet.